God of Trash, Cultivation LitRPG. By author Noct. Chapter 167 to 179. Rhys crouched at the edge of his camp, or rather, the one he'd assigned to himself. It was the most hazardous of all of them, a filthy mine that handled stones that exploded, sometimes, leaving the whole thing cloaked in ash and stone shards. Even where he crouched, he could suck mounds of trash into himself from simply breathing. He counted down the final seconds, his eyes on the guards. Tier 1. A joke, honestly. The Empire really had forgotten about their attacks, all those months ago. He didn't mind taking advantage of it, though. After today, they wouldn't be so lax about their security. He should take advantage of it while it lasted. Rhys waited for a few moments, quietly surveying the situation. He was the last to get into position, given that he was required to teleport everyone around. That had gone better than expected. The void was a scary place, and it sucked up his mana, but he'd known where he was going this time, and knew what to expect with the distances between holes. He'd only been able to transport one person at a time, but since each trip only took a few moments, it only took him about 15 minutes, maybe half an hour to transport everyone into place. A few of them stared in shock as Rhys transported them through the void, or cringed and closed their eyes, but for the most part, they had the attitude of business as usual, which he supposed wasn't beyond the pale for a world of magic where someone might control bees as easily as breathing. It was an attitude he appreciated and worked to cultivate, since the less they talked about what he'd done, or thought about it, the less likely they were to notice how strange it was, or realize that he was dealing with the void. He wasn't really sure what reputation the void had in this world, but he was pretty sure he didn't want to know. Better to keep playing around with none of whatever stigma the void had attached to him, rather than get randomly stigmatized for messing around with a power he hadn't explored fully yet. But everyone was in place now, and he still had time, since he'd told them all to wait for about the same amount of time so they could have something like a synchronized attack. He had a little time to observe, and make sure everything was as it seemed. He extended his senses, scanning the field. None of the guards reacted to his senses, and he didn't sense them as anything but Tier 1. There wasn't a warden, or a higher-ranked guard, in his vision, though he was sure there were some on the site. It would be insane if there weren't. Then again, this is the filthiest, most impure site. Maybe they filled it with losers with no future, and no mage who actually had rank or potential was willing to work here. He considered it for a moment, then shook his head. At the end of the day, the Empire was a military state. In the military, it didn't matter what rank you were, if you were told to go somewhere, you did. There had to be higher-ranked guards somewhere. He just hadn't seen them yet. Deliberately hidden to trick foolish insurgents into attacking. Or simply slacking off. Rhys moved around the outside of the camp, continuing to scan with his mana as he moved. He highly doubted it was the first, but just in case, he needed to know now, so he could call it all off instead. If this was some kind of nearly a-year-old trap, as unlikely as it was, better he caught it and called everyone back than fell into it, however improbable it was. He approached the large boxy barracks near the edge of the camp, and finally sensed the higher-tier mages. 2 Tier 2s, a Tier 3, and a Tier 4. Low Tier 4, but Tier 4 nonetheless. Rhys tensed. Fuck. There was a Tier 4 warden at my original camp, but he didn't show up often, and I was under the impression that he was there as a punishment. None of the other camps we hit up had a Tier 4, which reinforced my belief, but were those camps the fluke, rather than my first camp? If that's the case, I have to call it off. I should be able to beat a single low-ranked Tier 4, and this one doesn't feel extraordinarily powerful. More powerful than the warden, but not incredibly over my tier. The real complicating factor is dealing with a Tier 3 and 4 at the same time. Still, if every camp has a Tier 4, we're fucked. The Empire reinforced its camps after my first attacks, and we'll need to recalibrate. He scurried back to his trash can and teleported to the closest camp. Passing by his men with a quick, "Stay there," gesture, he hurried to the camp and scanned the barracks. He'd scanned them before, he wasn't stupid. True, He'd only ever scanned the camps at a distance, so he'd never seen anything but Tier 1s at the camp he'd picked for himself, but he'd never sensed a Tier 4 at base before. Tier 1s and 2s, a single low rank 3. Possible to defeat, especially since this was Sable's team. He gave her a thumbs up and jumped into the trash can, reappearing by Mouse. Mouse squeaked in surprise, but he gestured for her to be silent and ran by. Tier 2s and 1s. Back into the can and onto Corey. Again, Tier 2s and 1s, a low rank 3. He made a mental note that he'd probably have to help Corey's men and gestured for them to wait for him, then hopped in one last time. Lyra was floating in the nearby stream, and didn't react at all to him popping up. Like Mouse, her camp only had Tier 1s and 2s. It was only his camp that was problematic. Rhys considered for a moment, then nodded to himself. He popped back into the teleport. Mouse, I need you to watch the camp that I was going to lead. I'll bring Corey here instead. I'm going to lead Corey's team, and when we finish, I'll come back with reinforcements to take on that camp. But, if you notice any movement from the barracks, I need you to immediately notify me. Notify how? She whispered. One of the other mages stepped forward, the girl with the bees. Rhys couldn't recall her name, which was embarrassing, but he didn't have to remember right now. She opened her hand, showing them a cricket in a small cage. If you whisper a message to him, he'll fly to Rhys and repeat it. Mouse looked at the cage, then nodded and took it, putting it in her robes. I'll let you know. Rhys nodded. I'll be right back. Mouse, come with me. A few quick switches later, Rhys crouched at the head of Corey's old team. Mouse crouched alone in the forest outside Rhys's camp's barracks, and Corey led Mouse's old team. This way, Rhys could fight the Tier 3, Mouse could watch and alert them if the Tier 4 started moving, and once they cleared out all the other camps, if the Tier 4 didn't move, or especially if he did, they could all close in on the final camp that Rhys had meant to solo before he'd been confronted with a Tier 4, and take it on together. He'd need everyone for that base, it turned out. Honestly, I should have thought it was suspicious for only having Tier 1s long before go time, but I guess sometimes I really am an optimist at heart. Besides, he hadn't wanted to risk getting caught creeping around the barracks until go time, in case he gave up the whole attack by getting caught being suspicious. On top of all that, he probably still would have tried, if not for the Tier 4, and he was pretty sure the Tier 4 had only showed up today. There was no way he could have predicted a random Tier 4. I need to get more integrated into the Empire, Rhys realized. He pinched his chin. And why not? He was a successful businessman. He should be making appearances at other merchants, houses and whatnot, and all that bullshit. He didn't give a fuck about politics, but politics were useful when his goal wasn't to get ahead, but was instead to trash everyone else up. Plus, how else was he supposed to get dirt on the Empire's nobility? Nothing like a bit of gossip at a ball to really toss some filth on another family's face. He nodded to himself. We free these camps. We finish taking on the criminals. And then, we get invited to a ball. Failing that, we hold one. Failing that, we crash one. Actually, that sounded like way too much effort. He changed his priorities. After this, we crash a ball. The sun finished setting. The moon burned in the sky. Rhys turned to his men. It's time to move. They nodded back, and he charged in, the others falling in behind him. Rhys targeted the Tier 3 aura, while the others closed in on the Tier 1 guards. This camp was some kind of farm, which along with mines, was the most common kind of operation. Lyra was handling a strange kind of fish farm with her men, which was the only aquatic operation Rhys had seen so far, but then, it did kind of make sense that they'd need to farm water resources, too. If they were going to farm herbs and ores, why not farm shells, scales, fish, and water-based herbs, too? The Tier 1 guards fell one after another, rapidly taken out by the competent men he'd put under Corey initially. The Tier 3 guard's aura began moving toward the battlefield, and Rhys rushed to meet him, summoning an impurity blade to his hand as he approached. A bald man with a huge tattoo over half his face that vanished into his robes rushed at him, and he met that man. Rather than drawing a blade, the man's tattoo shone with bright red light, and he threw a punch at Rhys. Rhys tossed his impurity dagger to his offhand and pulled forth his broken sword. With only one hand on the blade, he barely managed to stop the man's fist. Despite the fact that he'd punched a bare blade, the man's red-tattooed hand hadn't taken so much as a scratch. The tattooed man laughed and drew his hand back, winding up to punch again. "One of the Empire's nobles, I take it?" Rhys asked. He eyed the man's untattooed side. It didn't look like there was anything special about it, but surely the man had some kind of technique to prevent someone from stabbing him in his obvious weak spot. "Indeed. You lay eyes upon the heir to the Jornish family," the man declared. "Jornish, more like headache," Rhys quipped without thinking. He tossed the impurity blade at the same time, sending it whistling toward the man's unmarked skin. Might as well try. Maybe the man was just an idiot. He doubted it, but he wouldn't know if he never tried. Pure white light glowed from the man's skin, and the dagger bounced off. At the same time, the red light faded from his tattooed skin. He laughed and hammered a punch at Rhys from his other side. "You'll have to wake up earlier than that to take a Jornish by surprise." "Oh goody," Rhys deadpanned. He kicked the man backward, then hammered at him from the left and right at the same time, impurity blade in one hand, sword in the other. The man grunted. Light shone from both sides of his body, but at the same time, strain appeared on his face, even before Rhys's strikes hit. The blades pushed in on him from either side, clenching around him like scissors. He pushed against Rhys's strikes, his impressive muscles straining. Rhys took a deep breath, then burped into the man's face. Corrosive gases poured over the man's features. The man held his breath, but the gas seeped into his eyes and ears. He stumbled back, shaking his head. Rhys chased after him, continuing to pour filthy gas on the man and keeping up the pressure at the same time. Abruptly, the man stopped. He screamed, and an orb of white and red light burst off of him, throwing Rhys back. Rhys jumped with the motion, flipping in the air to land on his feet. Before he landed, the man was already rushing him, clearly used to this kind of combo attack. Rhys raised his brows. He had to give it to the man, he knew his weak points, and he definitely covered them all. That left Rhys two options: a battle of attrition, which the man clearly wanted, or to find a way past the man's defenses to access his weak points anyways, which he was sure the man was also used to. Or I could just cheat. He gestured to his forehead, calling forth a black orb. The man, in the act of rushing him, widened his eyes and stumbled back, but too late. Rhys's orb made contact with his forehead, and he froze. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he trembled. The light faded from both halves of the man's body. Not one to wait around while attacks went through, Rhys stabbed him in the chest. The man's eyes cleared. "It'll take more than that to, URK. No, I think it'll take just that much," Rhys said. He put a hand to the man's forehead, and a thought occurred to him. Wasn't tattoo ink trash to the body it was in? He remembered reading an article back in his homeworld that tattooed people had slightly heightened white blood cell activity and inflammation for the rest of their lives after being tattooed. It wasn't enough to cause any real problems, but if the body identified it as trash, then. Rhys pulled. The man's impurities entered his body, and at the same time, the tattoo ink swirled from under his flesh and poured into Rhys's core. In the seconds before he died, while Rhys was sucking away his energy, the man's eyes locked onto Rhys's. "Why, if you could, tattoos, then. Oh, I just figured that out right now, actually. Would have made fighting you way easier, wouldn't it have?" Rhys commented to himself. He looked the man up and down. "What was it, Jordash? I'll have to remember to slurp your tattoos first, next time I face one of you." Jornish, the last of the man's energy left him, and he died. Rhys turned to the rest of the battle, then darted forth. There were still some tier 2s to deal with, and some tier 1s to suck the energy from. This battle wasn't over yet. Rhys finished up at that camp, wiping out the tier 1s and 2s with ease. Several of the mages wanted to join them, though a few only wanted to escape and simply leave the Empire forever. Rhys restored 1 or 2 cores, then rushed off to the next battle while the weakest member of their team escorted their new comrades home, and the rest regrouped at the trash can, awaiting teleportation. He told them to stay, and if they ran, to take the trash can, before he left. As long as the trash can was nearby, he could teleport to them and move them to their next location, after all. He hurried into the battle, rushing by the other fighters to join Sable in fighting the Tier 3. Her opponent was a true Blue Empire soldier in the white uniform and all, fighting with the Empire's fighting style. From the looks of it, it was the soldier who was on the back foot, while Sable was pressing her advantage to score injury after injury, ever so slightly tearing the Tier 3 down to size while learning a lot herself. She didn't even notice Rhys approach, so deep in battle was she. Rhys simply stood nearby and watched. If she could beat this man, she'd grow greatly in strength and experience. It was even possible that she'd gain the insights she needed to break through Tier 2 into Tier 3. He didn't have much time, but he had enough time to stand back and let Sable grow. The battle was already close to a conclusion before he arrived. The soldier's uniform was stained with blood, and he gritted his teeth, furious, then made one last furious thrust at Sable. Sable parried the thrust with her clawed hands, grabbed a hold of his hands, and yanked him in. The limbs on her back darted forth, piercing through his chest and out the rear, his throbbing heart clutched in their sharp tips. Rhys stared, his jaw dropped. Hot. He coughed. I mean, terrifying. Ha ha. Scary. Oh no, wouldn't want that to happen to me. Energy coiled around Sable. Her core thrummed with power. She curled up, whole body clenching in around itself, and then stood up tall as a new burst of power flew from her body. Her eyes shone with excitement, and she stared at her hands, slowly curling her fingers. Did you tear up? Rhys asked. She whirled, startled. When did you get here? Right before the part where you Kali-ma'd that guy, Rhys said. She squinted. The heart ripping, he clarified. Sable nodded, understanding, then smiled. She nodded again, this time affirmatively rather than personal. I did. I'm Tier 3 now. Congrats. Rhys went to pat her on the back, only to find way too many joints back there, then awkwardly offered a high five instead. She stared at his hand, lost, and he put it down. That's awesome, though. We badly need more Tier 3s. Aren't you afraid I'll outrank you? No. Why would I be afraid of that? That'd be awesome, actually. We sorely lack a Tier 4. Sable blinked at him, then laughed. What if I wanted to take control? As long as you listened to my good advice, I'd be fine with that. Leader is a lot of work, it turns out. I wouldn't mind letting someone else take the reins for a bit so I could relax. She pursed her lips. I was teasing. Oh. Well, so was I, Rhys said quickly. He hurried past her to suck the last of the Tier 3's energy. He'd need a lot of cores at the end of this. We about finished here. About, yes. Why? The Camp 1 was going to solo. I found out at the last minute that I'd been vastly underestimating it. We're going to need all hands on deck for. Chirp, chirp. Rhys stared around, going still. What? It's just a cricket, Sable said. Where is it? Find it, quickly, Rhys said. It was unseasonal for crickets. That had to be the messenger cricket that Mouse had taken with her. She gave him a funny look, but half closed her eyes anyways. Her body blurred, and a moment later, 2 bony limbs still stained with blood delicately clutched a cricket between them. Rhys held out his hands, and she deposited it into his. The cricket hopped once, then went completely still. Mouse's voice emerged from the shiny black body. Rhys, come quickly. The Tier 4 is moving, and he's moving fast. All the high ranks are moving together. I think they're going to. Silence. Rhys's heart clenched. He looked at Sable who stared back at him, equally tense. A random mage ran past, and Rhys grabbed his arm. Gather everyone and get out of here. Take the trash can with you, but run. Just run. The man blinked, then nodded and ran off with a salute. Sable and Rhys ran ahead of him. He grabbed her hand without thinking, and after a second, she grabbed back. The trash can loomed. He leapt into it, taking Sable with him. The two of them pierced through the void. Rhys hurtled through as fast as he could, and they came out at Mouse's point. Some time had passed since Mouse's message. The cricket was enhanced and magically sped up, but it still took time for it to fly from one location to another. The Tier 4 and Tier 3 signatures were all gathered up and hurrying across the camp. Mouse was right next to the trash can, and as they burst through, she startled, almost jumping out of her skin. She clapped her hands over her mouth to keep from yelping, then stepped forward, gesturing at Rhys and Sable, then pointing at the group of high-rank mages passing nearby. Rhys nodded. He already understood. Beside him, Sable prickled, all her limbs twitching with battle lust. Mouse glanced at the two of them, then fell back. She went translucent in Rhys's senses, as if she were fading out of existence. Rhys ran forward, Sable at his side. He nodded at her. You take the Tier 3, I'll take the Tier 4. Mouse, hold off the rest of them. Kill them if you can. Sable nodded. From behind, there was a whisper that might have been yes. The three of them split. Rhys ran ahead, Sable fell slightly behind them, and Mouse, well, Mouse was somewhere. He wasn't sure where, but that was what Mouse was all about. Up ahead, the Tier 4 sensed him coming and slowed. In the darkness, their form wasn't clear at first, but as they turned, the details of their body came into clear light. Long, bushy red hair, sharp eyes, and a generous figure. Wait, generous figure. He blinked, looking up and down. A girl. Undoubtedly female. She reminded him of the redhead Lyra had mentioned, and the redheaded noble he'd run into at the other camp. He pointed at her. A member of the Infernan clan, no doubt. So you know of my family, she said. She wore a black cloak, held at the shoulder with a large red ruby as a brooch. Reaching to the brooch, she pulled, and threw the whole cloak aside to reveal a shiny, tight-knit mesh of silver armor that looked not unlike the fire-resistant suits of Rhys's world, except for the fact that in Rhys's world, the suits were bulky and ugly, and hers was skin-tight, showing off that generous figure he'd seen even through the cloak, and hugging thick thighs tight. A rapier was strapped to her fantastic hips, the perfect accentuation to her hourglass figure. She snapped her fingers, and the cloud of red hair that had until this moment floated around her shoulders tied itself back into a tight bun. Damn, practical and fashionable, work, queen, Rhys said, looking appreciatively. She blinked at him, lost. Am I not allowed to compliment fine fashion sense? I'm not used to my enemies commenting on my wardrobe before they burn to ash, she stated coolly. Rhys grinned. That's 'cause I gotta let you know I appreciate the look before I kill you dead. She drew her rapier. Fire trailed from the slender blade and burst in a flourish, hot even from where Rhys stood. Wait. Before we start, do you have a brother with a submissive streak and a shame kink? Maybe an uncle. He's repressing it, but it's there. Her eyes narrowed. They were hot blue, like propane flames. She thought for a moment, then inclined her head an inch. Perhaps you refer to Uncle Harrion. Big guy. Bushy red hair. He is an Infernan. Friendly with the Empress. At that, her lip twitched. He does receive an unfair amount of her attention. Rhys snapped. That's the one. I've got a bone to pick with him. Do you like him? If not, drop me a hint, and I'll kill him after you die. Won't do much for you, but at least you can have the satisfaction of fucking him over. She let out a haughty snort. Why would I betray a fellow Infernan? I dunno, I had plenty of family members I would have sold off for a dime. Back home, most of his family had been assholes to him, borderline if not outright abusive. He'd cut off most of them and refused to talk to them anymore, and good riddance, but sometimes they clawed their way back in. Usually at the most inopportune time, like when he was behind deadline on a costume or at work. She thought for a moment, then laughed aloud and flourished her blade, raising it to a high stance. Draw your blade, rogue. We'll see the measure of you first. Oh, I like you. My name is Rend, by the way. Truly. Nah, but it's cool, isn't it? You may know me as Adelise Infernan, so that you might know who killed you today. Ah, don't worry, I'm pretty persistent about that username. If you tell him Rend sent you in the afterlife, they'll know who sent ya. Rhys drew his broken sword and swirled it, the flourish less impressive but intentionally trashy enough to mock her actually impressive flourish. Fire scorched down her blade and seared over her body. It flared, burning so bright that it scorched Rhys's vision, and then Adelise was there, upon him. He barely raised his sword in time, not that it mattered, even with trash intent to block. Her flames surged past his guard and burned his hand, arm, and chest. Holy shit, big sis ain't kidding, Rhys thought to himself, and then he thought nothing at all as the two of them exchanged blows faster than thought itself. Fire flared, flashing off her silver suit and splashing over Rhys. Rhys pushed impurities into his sword and sent them flying at her in a pale imitation of her flaming sword, but they were burnt away by the purifying flames or bounced off her silver shell. He grimaced and jumped back, parting for a moment. Trash body was already active, and he could already tell his impurity daggers and gas attack would do little, unless he found a true, earnest opening. Fire was a worse match for him than he'd expected, especially Adelise's flames, which seemed to turn his impurities into ash and weaken them, if not outright eliminate them. A boot slammed into his solar plexus. All the breath left him and intense pain blasted through him as the impact hit his burns, the pain strong enough to break through Trash body's numbing effect. He stumbled back, barely holding back the urge to vomit from sheer pain. The pain welled up, rushing large all at once, and it nearly overwhelmed his being for a moment. It was all he could do to hang on and not pass out. Not even your parents will recognize your ashes, Adelise intoned. She lifted her sword high, and a fireball condensed on its tip, growing larger moment by moment. You will be naught but smoke on the wind. Saying that to the orphan. Can you believe it? Insane, Rhys shot back. Sweat dripped down his back, and the burns on his chest stung. He gazed at the fireball, his heart pounding. That was a true Tier 4 attack. She was no warden, held back by her inadequacies, weak to impurities, locked away in a mind to watch useless prisoners for her uselessness. She was powerful. Truly, deeply powerful. He was an ant, and she was the heartless magnifying glass, searing him with the might of the sun. Something. There has to be something. Some attack, some way out of this situation. Rhys's brain churned. Every weapon he'd ever had the chance to use passed through his mind, every sword technique, every desperate situation. He'd been cocky. So cocky. To think the warden was the same as any other Tier 4. To think they could be so easily defeated, with a few neat tricks. Foolish. 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 Landon was already nearly insurmountable as a high Tier 3 who naturally resisted his attacks. What chance did he stand against this Tier 4 who perfectly opposed him? Farron had been one thing. He could easily counter a weak flame. In fact, he was an ideal counter to a weak flame. But just like a candle could only make garbage more toxic to the one holding the candle, but an incinerator could burn garbage away to ash, Adelise's strong flames were the counter that Farron had wished he could be. But even if he was battling an incinerator instead of easily snuffing a small campfire, there still had to be a way. The fundamental properties of flame and garbage hadn't changed, nor had their interactions. Even an incinerator could be overwhelmed. I can't give up. There has to be. Adelise flicked her rapier. The fireball flew forth. The fireball flew forth. It loomed large in Rhys's vision, eclipsing the moon, then the sky, then everything. He reached into his trash star, and called back to his earliest days. It was time to pull out an old classic. He threw piece after piece of garbage at the impending fireball, using trash manipulation to hold all the trash together. His hands moved at lightning speeds, so fast they seemed to blur. Faster and faster, throwing more and more garbage, until he created a trash ball of equal size to the fireball. But that wasn't enough. The fireball hit it and began burning and melting through the trash. Rhys activated trash intent on the whole trash ball, treating it as one item, and that slowed its melting and burning, but didn't stop the process. He didn't let that keep him from tossing more and more trash into the ball, then extending his trash intent to include the new trash, while holding it all in place with trash manipulation. It was excellent training, but the sweat dripping down his back and face from the sheer, indefatigable heat from the fireball meant he barely noticed. More. More trash. Enough to block out this tiny sun. He had to have enough. Enough trash to overwhelm even this purifying fire. The trash burned, and the fireball darkened. Rhys's eyes brightened in turn, as if he were the one stealing the light from the fireball. He piled on more trash, compacting it around the fireball with trash manipulation. The fireball grew dimmer and dimmer, until finally, it winked out. Although this all took some time to describe, it played out in the space of a single breath. Across from him, Adelise swirled her rapier. Flames danced around the slender blade, like a ribbon twirling around a baton. You did well to block the first fireball. But what about the rest? She flicked her blade, and a dozen fireballs filled the sky. They flared bright, then rained down on Rhys, hammering him from the heavens. Cursing under his breath, Rhys threw the remains of the trash ball at the closest one, then fled. The other fireballs chased him doggedly. He formed trash ball after trash ball. Sometimes, pieces of garbage would fall out of the trash ball and clutter the ground, leaving a mess behind him. He didn't care, though. Right now, the most important thing was to block or cancel the fireballs. One trash ball took out 2 fireballs. He formed another, but only made it halfway before a fireball struck his half-finished creation out of his hands. Another made it to the basic shape stage, only for a fireball to smash into him and send him stumbling, but taking the hit meant he could use a fully formed trash ball to wipe out the next 3 fireballs. Another hurtled down, and he leapt to the side at the last second, letting it hit the ground. Between the trash balls and Rhys's dodging, he managed to survive the volley. Some of the fireballs got through and struck the ground, setting the undergrowth and the earth itself, it seemed, alight. Dark fumes rose from the ground, and the fires raged higher, burning in strange colors. Adelise scoffed. "There's no saving you. Now that you're surrounded by my flames, it's time to die." She flicked her rapier. Grand Inferno. Nothing happened. Frowning, she looked at the rapier, then looked at the ground again. Her brows furrowed deeper, and she flicked the rapier again, but again, nothing. Rhys began to chuckle. It built and built, growing from a chuckle to a cackle, to a full-out evil laugh, hands clawed at the sky, spread stance and all. "You fool. Do you realize what you've done?" Adelise narrowed her eyes. "All that fire you've been throwing, you've thrown it into my trash. This fire is no longer your fire. It's now a dumpster fire. Trash fire. In other words, my fire." She jolted, then stared at the ground. As Rhys had said, the ground was indeed covered in trash. Her flames had spread over the earth, but as they'd spread over the earth, they'd grown into Rhys's trash as well, until there wasn't a single flame on the ground around them that wasn't at least partially grounded in garbage. These were no purifying flames, but filthy, disgusting, toxic, trash flames. Fire no one would want. No one could cook with it, light with it, or warm themselves with it, not without tainting their bodies with filth and impurities. It was a flame only Rhys could love, but dear gods, did he love it. Rhys grinned, then clawed upward. Grand Dumpster Inferno. The strangely colored flames, belching dark smoke, surged into the sky. They converged into a filthy trash-strewn fireball, then bore down on Adelise. She turned and ran, but Rhys clicked his tongue. There was a new level to one of his techniques, one that had been brewing in the background all this time without him realizing it, but as he watched Adelise flee, it suddenly came to the forefront of his mind. Pushing down at her with one hand to speed the trash fireball on, he pointed at the flaming, garbage-covered floor with the other. Trash step, obstruction. The garbage on the ground shifted all but imperceptibly. Where before, Adelise's natural mage-boosted agility had her steps land true, now, they landed on strangely shaped pieces of trash. She slipped, her ankle twisting, and fell to a knee. That was all the opening Rhys needed. He slammed his hand down, and the trash fireball smashed into Adelise. She screamed, batting at the flames, but to no avail. Rhys still had control of them through trash manipulation, and sought out the openings in her silver gear to singe her to filthy ash. It was an obvious weakness, one she was all but telegraphing with her silver gear. If it was heat and fire resistant, like the fire resistant gear he'd seen back home, then that meant she wasn't herself immune or highly resistant to heat or fire. Ergo, turning her own flames against her through a trashy twist of his own was highly effective to injure her, even though he usually wouldn't attempt to use a specialist's element against them. Whether it was something deficient in her training regimen, she didn't like the pain of training resistances, she had no karma with resistance skills, or something completely out of his consideration, like some kind of special constitution that was uniquely poorly suited to fire defense. He had no idea, but he knew, from her clothes, that this would be effective against her. And he was right. She screamed and flailed as the fire surged into her, scorching her to ash. He felt bad about it, but only for a moment before he remembered that she would have made all her victims and everyone she fought against feel this way before she killed them. There was no need to feel pity for someone who would inflict this same pain upon others. It was simply a case of, what goes around, comes around, and she was taking her turn to be immolated. Maybe she might have had a counterattack or a defense, if she had kept her wits about her when the fire began to burn off her flesh rather than off Rhys's trash, and Rhys himself felt his control slip, but she screamed in pain instead, which was totally understandable, and thrashed about on the ground, until she could thrash no more. Her body stilled, a large portion of it not but blackened ash. Rhys approached at a jog and sucked out all the energy, impurities, and everything else that he could. Surprisingly, he could take a portion of her body with him, but only the part that had been burned to ash. The rest of her didn't qualify as trash, only that portion did. He raised his brows. That would be an interesting way to farm trash, but then again, it would be slower than farming trash the usual way, or simply by attacking trash people in the first place. It wasn't a good idea to try to farm people as his primary trash. Anyways, it led to the kind of thinking he didn't want to end up in, where he simply saw everyone around him as potential resources. He turned to the field of burning trash around him. Holding out his hand, he sucked it all into his trash star once more, returning it from whence it had came. He didn't want to leave trash behind, not to mention that he shouldn't leave too much evidence around. If they picked up that it was one particular tier 3 with a very particular fighting style who was causing all this chaos, his chances of continuing to get away with chaos went down. And he had a lot of chaos left inside of him. With the trash collected, his opponent defeated, and all the pieces gathered, Rhys turned to the other battle going on. Sable, newly minted tier 3, versus the Empire's tier 3. This one wasn't a soldier, but instead a noble of some kind, who wielded a strange-looking sword that seemed to be made of rainbows. Sable clearly didn't like the light that shot off from the blade whenever the mage pointed it her way, but when she got close, she had the overwhelming advantage with her extra limbs than the somewhat clumsy tier 3 did. Rhys would have let it play out, but they only had so much time, and there wasn't much left. He charged in, adding a second challenger to the fight. The rainbow sword user pointed their scintillating light attack at him, their first and only mistake. Rhys deflected it with some trash, and Sable immediately pounced upon their distraction to deliver a series of heavy blows to the mage. While the mage dealt with that, Rhys harried them from the side, and between him and Sable, the two of them quickly dismantled the mage. Rhys sucked up the man's impurities and energy, and that was that. The tier 4 and tier 3, both dealt with. He collected the man's sword, noting how beautiful the rainbow-colored light that made up the blade itself was. Just to experiment, he tried thrusting it, but no light shot out. Frowning, he summoned a piece of trash and struck through it, or tried to. The light simply bounced off. Huh, Rhys muttered. Seemed like this piece of equipment needed practice, comprehension, or some specific skill to combo with it for it to work right, kind of like his broken sword and his trash and tent. He tucked it into his storage ring, making a note for later. He could offer it to any of the mages back at camp, or anyone they rescued today. If anyone could use it, it would be worth it. Not for the first time, his mind went to the sun sword buried on the grounds of Purple Dawn. He considered the rainbow sword again. Like that sword, it was a sword based on light, like a quarry, his first schoolmaster's sword. Were they all related, somehow? Or were swords based on light just popular in this world? They had been in his world, anyways, so he could understand that. There'd been no end of lightsabers flashing around, some of them more or less creative in their application of light and sword. It's something to look into, but not something to waste too much time on, he concluded. Turning to Sable, he gestured. Let's go help Mouse clean up and get out of here before anyone else gets here. Our time is running out. Someone is going to react to us attacking the bases sooner rather than later at this point. Sable nodded, and the two of them jogged to where Mouse was fighting with the lower-tier mages. Mouse fought the mages in the forest, or rather, it looked far more like an elaborate game of backwards hide-and-seek was going on in the forest, with all the low-tier mages as the seekers and Mouse as the single hider. Occasionally, a blade leapt out of a bush or a shadow to strike an unsuspecting searcher, though the strikes were rarely vital, let alone fatal. Still, the annoying strikes were enough to keep the finders on their toes, and they did slowly sap their attention, strength, and stamina. By the time Rhys and Sable arrived, the haggard low-tier mages could have been taken out by a particularly motivated Tier 1, let alone 2 Tier 3s. They swept the field clean, and Mouse finally poked her head out of the forest. Is it over? Rhys looked up from where he was sucking the energy out of a rapidly withering corpse, only to suck the corpse into his core, too. He didn't know, but if the man went into his core that easily, he must have been truly horrific to the prisoners. It's over. We just need to collect the mages from the mine. He paused, looking at the mine before them. Probably safest if I do that. That place looks dangerous. Mouse nodded. I would appreciate it. It's not that dangerous, Sable murmured, looking the mine over. Yeah, but I can clear it out no problem, alone, Rhys told her. He nodded. I'll be right back. It wasn't just that he didn't need to worry about impurities if he was alone. He could also freely suck up all the gunk and trash inside the place without worrying about a single thing. Plus, it wasn't like people were going to fight against his rescue. He just had to tell them he was showing them the way out, and they ought to follow him. Leaving the girls behind, he stepped into the mine. Just as he'd hoped, it was a highly toxic environment full of impurities and other gunk. And all of it was his delicious filth. Whenever he found a worker, he simply pulled them gently away from their task and pointed them at the door. You're free, friend. You don't have to work here anymore. Dust and filth flowed into his core non-stop. There was so much dirt, and so many impurities, that his trash star stuttered a few times from borderline overload. It was a far cry from his times earlier, where he'd been struggling to find any trash at all. I need to spend more time in mines, he noted to himself with a chuckle. Mines really were the perfect ground to suck up garbage. The deeper he went into the mines, the worse off the mages were. As he'd been going, he'd been absorbing their impurities before setting them free, but in the depths, even he struggled to suck all the impurities out of them without killing them. The best he could do was to clean them up just enough to get them back to base human normal, rather than restore them to mage normal or even perfect. Darkness closed in around him. The air grew choking. He struggled to breathe, even with his impurity and filth filters. He found one body, then another. His heart sank, and he kept going, but found nothing, nothing, nothing. Death and filth, filth and death. He left the bodies where they were, testament to the Empire's ill treatment, and returned to the surface. There was nothing down there. Nothing alive, anyways. At least, nothing for now. He looked over his shoulder as he exited the mine, mentally marking this place. This was an impure hole that even he'd struggled to plunge, a mine full of filth even more advanced than an impure well. If he'd kept going, he wasn't sure he could have survived. It would have been fine training, walking deeper and deeper into the mine while the impurities racked his body, but now was not the time for training. He had to rescue the mages, not train himself. Still, he made sure he really remembered this place. I should come back here. When he had more time. When he didn't have an empire to take down. When he simply could focus on himself, and making himself stronger by any means necessary, then, he'd return to this mine. Sable and Mouse, and from the looks of it, mostly Mouse, had sorted out who among the rescued mages wanted to flee, and who wanted to fight. Rhys took the ones who wanted to fight through the portal to their old base, the one in the garbage heap, which they could abandon immediately if any of these people happened to be untrustworthy. He dove back through the portal once everyone was back and hurried to the next camp, then the next, and the one after that. At last, he came to Lyra's camp. Lyra had already swum off, but her men and the new recruits huddled by the trash can, waiting for rescue. Rhys popped up to grab the first, then froze. He turned toward the horizon. "What?" one of the men asked. "Someone's coming. High tier. I can't tell how high." He took a deep breath, then looked at the men. "If you're a mage, pick up someone who isn't and start running. You carry the trash can. I'm going to take as many of you as I can back. Hold formation until the absolute last second, then scatter. If you're captured, then we have the resolve," a female mage stated firmly. Rhys glanced at her. He wasn't sure what that meant, but it sounded good, so he nodded. "You understand. You, come here." He gestured to the weakest non-mage, then scooped her up. She was young, the youngest of the group, at barely 14. "I'll be back. Don't lose faith, and keep moving." With that, he dove into the trash can, and the mages began to run. Rhys burst out at the base, set the girl down, and went to dive back in. "What's going on?" Sable asked shortly. "Big guy coming. I can't deal with them. Gotta get everyone out. Want me to help?" Rhys looked at her. "You can't go through the void without me, right?" She walked to the void and put her hand against it, then through. She looked at him. "Huh? Why? How? Was it something to do with curse power or impurities? Or maybe because she was the child of a remnant weapon? There was no way of knowing, but if she could enter the void, too, then she could help him ferry people, and he could use the help." He nodded. "Let's go." Both of them dove into the void. Rhys led the way, and they popped out at the side of the racing mages. Rhys grabbed one of the powerless ex-mages, not quite trusting Sable to properly protect what was basically immortal, and Sable took one of the mages. They dove back into the void. Back and forth, ferrying people through the void. The powerful signature grew closer and closer, hurtling toward them. If he'd had any delusion that the powerful signature wasn't coming for them, it was dashed as the signature obviously altered its path to chase after them. Closer and closer and closer. Straw jumped into the trash can with the final mage. Rhys stared at the sky, holding the final rescued ex-mage. The second he got a glimpse of the figure, he leapt into the trash can and let it whisk him away. Bushy red hair. A broad chest visible through an opened shirt, marred with scars. A broad-chinned face, teeth gritted in anger. That has to be him, right? The one who punished Lyra. He was too strong to fight today, but he'd fight him sometime in the future. In the void, Rhys looked back at the void holes that belonged to the trash can he'd escaped through. He held out his hand, pulling inward, not sure if it would work or not. The trash can was made of trash, but it was not only on the other side of a dimensional boundary, but also a dimensional boundary itself. He had no idea what the voids would do, if he sucked their bounds away, but there was no time to worry about that. The edges fluttered. The voids shuddered. A wave of fire slammed into them, spurting through into the void, and then the ashes that had once been the trash can fluttered through the void into Rhys's hand. The void holes collapsed, leaving nothing behind. Rhys blinked, then shook his head. Right. The holes have always let my mana through. Why wouldn't they let everyone's through? It was his fortune that the fire had destroyed the can before the whole attack had gone through the holes. If that had been an assassination attempt or a single piercing attack, he would have been in trouble. He glanced at the other holes. Should I destroy them? He considered it for a second, then shook his head and headed out of the void into the hideout. If he was attacked through a different trash can, in other words, if the Empire put together that all trash cans were bad, then he would immediately destroy them all. But there was no need to destroy his teleportation network before it even really got started. He paused a moment, just long enough to absorb the other trash cans he'd used at the camps back into his core, then stepped out of the void and into his base. "You made it?" Sable asked. Rhys set down the mage he'd been carrying. "Yeah. It was close, but yeah. You guys were chased. Mouse squeaked, startled. Rhys nodded. It could have been bad, but I got out in time. I think I might have met Lyra's mortal enemy. Oh, yeah? Mouse asked, a little concerned. Not for long. Like I said, I ran immediately. I'll have to ask Lyra to be sure, but I'm pretty sure it's him. She nodded, still concerned but at least repressing it, if not completely pushing it down. Rhys turned to the assembled ex-mages. I can't give everyone cores today, and I can't do more than tier 1 for any given core. Don't worry, you can continue to level up the core just as you did before. However, I can't start you any higher than tier 1, no matter your original rank was. Understanding that, please step forward. Form a stately line. If I see any misbehavior, you're going straight to the back of the line, and make no mistake. There was some murmuring at that, but no one dared to go contrary to him, not when he was handing out something so essential. He managed to give almost a dozen of them cores before he simply ran out of free energy in his core. Even with as much as he'd been pulling in energy, he didn't have an unlimited supply, and at the end of the day, he could only do the best he could. He turned to the rest of them apologetically. I couldn't give you cores this time, but just wait. I'll find the energy somewhere. If you want to leave and live a peaceful life escaping the Empire rather than wait for a core, I understand, but if you remain, understand that you commit to this lifestyle. I can't afford to let anyone go, once they've seen enough of our operation. You all hate the Empire as much as I do, I'm sure, and you understand how big an undertaking it is to take it down. I can't afford to make a single mistake. Please, don't be a mistake. A few of the mages murmured uncomfortably amongst themselves at that, but Rhys just smiled. If you understand that, then please stay around. If you don't, then leave. It's simple, isn't it? They glanced amongst one another, but in the end, no one moved. Rhys dusted off his hands. Right. Everyone who just joined, speak with Corey, Blake, or one of the other mages who's been around for a while. They'll get you started. There's things you can do for the resistance even as a mortal. He mentally capitalized resistance for the first time. It was the first time it felt like one. Looking out at 50-some people, how could he not feel like a resistance leader? For the first time, he felt like he'd done something. Actually begun something real. He knew the chips shop were essential to his plans, but they felt like so little. A candle in the wind, compared to the Empire. A small debuff against the most powerful army he'd encountered, that might one day help someone else take down the Empire some tiny amount that they might not even notice. This was a resistance force. This was something that might topple the Empire one day, all on its own, with the powerful assistance of Rhys intentionally using the chip's debuff to its greatest power at the precise moment they needed it most. He smiled, just a little. It's happening. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Of course, now that they had people, what they needed the most were cores. With about 40 left, and a conversion rate of 3-ish kills to 1 core assuming a tier 1 core, the price was lowered by obtaining higher power energy that meant he had to kill somewhere in the range of 60 to 120 more mages. It was something of a staggering number to consider. I'm pretty sure most serial killers, no, I'm not sure if a serial killer in my homeworld ever hit that kind of body count. And that was only counting the mages he was planning to kill, not the ones he'd already killed. He raised his brows, pursing his lips a little. By the morality of his home, he was beyond evil and ought to be condemned to death immediately. By the morality of this world, he was just the boy next door. He'd probably killed people with higher body counts already. Crazy. No wonder higher tiers had so few members. They'd all been taken out on the way up by their peers. Comprehension bottlenecks and power limits didn't help. Honestly, it was a small miracle that there were any number of higher tier mages. He snorted to himself. That was one way of thinking of it. On the other, this world seemed enormous, and the population centers weren't struggling. The city he'd grown up in was a small one, but it was still home to 10,000 or so people, at a rough estimate, and every city he'd passed by on his way through the empire had been far larger. There were lots and lots of babies being born, and even if only 10%, no, 1%, were chosen as mages, that meant hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of chaff mages being created every year. Given the way lifespans and sturdiness grew, it was only due to intense inter-mage competition that the world wasn't absolutely clogged with high-tier mages, or at least millions upon millions of low-tier mages. Having established that the population economics made sense, or at least as much sense as he'd expect them to make from some rough estimates and some napkin math, Rhys turned his mind back to the question at hand: how to acquire 120-some mages worth of cores. There was an obvious answer, and one that he didn't even feel that bad, morally speaking, about: raid the criminals. The Water Syndicate was but one small arm of a much larger, much more populated syndicate. Even if he took prisoners and accepted surrenders, as opposed to the war crime known as no quarter, he was pretty sure he'd be able to kill 100 and some scumbags that way. Once he was that close, he could make up the difference by freeing camps or otherwise antagonizing the Empire. Hell, if it was close enough, honor duels among random mages might even be enough. Not that he was looking to engage in dozens of those, but he could never predict the future. He snorted to himself, looking at his hands. As far as he could recall, until the Empire had taken over, he hadn't killed anyone. Now look at him, out killing serial killers. Guess getting abused in a mine for a few years changes your perspective. It helped that he was absolutely sure of the Empire's evil nature and the need to remove it all, like the big fat malignant tumor it was. It was trashy of him that it hadn't been that big of a mental blow to kill. He supposed that he'd taken it in stride, more or less, and kept trucking. But it hadn't felt that memorable in the moment, and he didn't feel any guilt about it looking back. The numbness he felt toward the whole situation felt a bit off to him, like the mental equivalent of an old injury he hadn't quite probed the depths of, but he didn't want to probe it. Not in this world, where taking a life was a daily occurrence, and kill or be killed wasn't some platitude but base reality. Though, I guess, if I could put that filth into my mental attack, it might be worth probing. He didn't know that it was. His mental attack was basically the same as clapping in someone's face to stun them against any reasonable opponent, and going further didn't seem likely to obtain further gains. To put it in other terms, he was pretty sure he was already at the point of diminishing returns, with no need to pursue the next 1% of improvement. There was a chance of insta-gibbing Tier 1 opponents, but it was just like the death spell in RPGs. The only enemies that weren't immune to it weren't worth the MP it took to cast death. He had a dozen ways to insta-gib Tier 1s that didn't involve standing immobile for 10 seconds as he activated a slow attack. It's a last-ditch, tip the scales, straw in the camel's back kind of attack, he decided, mentally shelving further development. Better to focus on more obvious trash approaches for now. His mind went back to the last battle, and a jolt of regret went through him. He'd totally abandoned Adelisa's silver coat. If it really was fireproof, then he'd missed out on stealing some useful loot. Could have used that gear against the entire Infernan family. Then again, on the other hand, I did immolate her through it. Maybe it was for the best that he'd left it behind. Gear that gave a false sense of security but no actual protection was worse than not wearing gear at all. Besides, he couldn't use Trash Body so easily without Trash Body. He looked down at himself. It was still active. He'd totally forgotten that he was using it. The mana cost was almost zero, and it and pain mitigation numbed the pain so much that he'd simply forgotten that he was horrifically burned. True, self-regeneration functioned even when he was awake and walking around on his 2 feet, even if it functioned better when he was asleep, but even so, it worked better when he slept, and he certainly hadn't done that yet. He shook his head at himself and wandered over by Lyra, who'd floated up to base at some point. "Yes, schoolmaster," she asked. "Gods, don't even joke about that. I don't want that responsibility. You already have far more serious responsibility." Rhys stared at her. She smiled slowly. At last, she shrugged and said, "What? It's true. It's true, but I don't want to acknowledge it. Anyways, I'm tired, and I need to rest and heal up before we do anything else. Get the new recruits started, see what materials they need, see if they need weapons, whatever. When I wake up, we can figure all that out, or I guess, if you guys can find it. I'm pretty sure everyone here knows how a store operates, and Mouse is just as capable at entering the library as you are, she said, cutting him off. Rhys took a deep breath. Right, and those who don't want to fight can be sent to the stores, and shown the ropes there. Gods know we need more people to man our shops. I'm gonna go nap. Go forth, fearless leader. Nap fearlessly, Lyra said, with only a hint of snark in her voice. Rhys waved at her and jogged away. His mind was in shambles, his thoughts were everywhere, and he was so badly injured that his skills were entirely keeping him from feeling the pain anymore, even if he wasn't in any way healed from his injuries. This was not the time to go on being fearless leader, this was the time to give up and go rest. The trash heap and the first store were relatively close to one another. He made the quick transit, then headed upstairs to the attic of the shop. Yawning, he nudged some random gear to the side and went to lay down. Abruptly, he jumped up, whirling toward the corner of the building. His hair stood on end, and every warning siren his body had screamed that something was wrong, but he couldn't see anything. There was nothing there. It's like Mouse. Just because I can't see it right away, doesn't mean there's nothing there. He blinked, slowly, turning his focus more and more deliberate, until suddenly, there was a ragged man sitting in the corner of the shop. Or rather, he'd always been there, but it was just now that Rhys had finally taken notice of him. The same old man, in fact, who'd been sitting by the impure well in the forest. The one who'd told him that Leonard was dead, despite having seemingly no way to know that. "Who are you?" he asked, wary, but not quite ready to reach for his weapons yet. "You're tired. Rest first. We can talk after," the old man said gently. "That's not an answer. Who are you?" Rhys demanded. He wasn't stupid enough to fall asleep with some mysterious old guy watching over him. That was basics, like, don't take candy from strangers, and, don't drink something someone else has touched. Someone with your best interests at heart. An answer. The old man sighed. "Would you believe if I told you I was, something like an echo of a remnant weapon? An echo of a piece of something that was once a part of the Demon Lord's armory?" Rhys asked incredulously. The old man spread his hands. Something sparked in Rhys's mind. He picked up a random pebble from the ground and tossed it at the man. It flew straight through him and knocked against the wood beams behind him. The old man wasn't physical. He was a ghost or a projection, something like that. Rhys raised his brows. A ghost or projection probably couldn't hurt him in his sleep. Well, maybe a ghost could, but a projection, probably not. The man snorted and gestured, as if that proved it. "Only an echo. I even lack a material body. How am I going to harm you? Rest. You need the break. I'll be here when you wake up, and we can speak then." "You'd better be," Rhys said, not that he could threaten the ghost any more than the ghost could threaten him. Still, the fact that the man was a remnant weapon, he knew it shouldn't make him relax more, but somehow, it did make him more relaxed around the guy. Probably because Sable and Straw were both pretty cool, even if they were odd in their own ways. Straw had looked after him, and picked him up when no one else would, and while Sable had fought for Ernesto, she had never really agreed with his objectives, and she'd fought hard on his side ever since. It was a weird bias to have, but it was what his experiences had shown him to be true, so there was no reason not to believe it. That didn't mean that he was going to roll over and agree with this guy whose only argument was, "I'm not going to hurt you because I can't, no word on if I want or not," but it did help. That, and the fact that the old man hadn't hurt him near the impure well, and had even told him about Leonard. The old man had demonstrably done nothing to harm him, so there was no reason to doubt him now, even if he was hella spooky. Giving him one last uncertain look, Rhys laid down and closed his eyes. He thought he'd have a hard time falling asleep with some stranger with unknown motives watching him, but he was surprisingly able to pass right out with no hesitation. He fell into a deep sleep, and time passed on. Sun filtered in the window. Birdsong filled the air. Rhys opened his eyes and breathed deep, enjoying the pale light of early morning. He felt wildly refreshed, far more comfortable than he had last night. It wasn't that he'd had no pain, he realized now, it was just that he had gotten so used to being in constant, low-level pain that he'd stopped feeling the pain consciously, and loaded it all onto his subconscious instead. He yawned and shifted a little, considering whether to go back to sleep or bother getting up. Good morning. Rhys jolted, sitting dead upright. He whirled, instinctively reaching for the broken sword in his robes. The ghost man raised his hands in mock surrender. It's only me. I didn't kill you in your sleep, either. That is true, Rhys allowed. He gave the man a long look, then lowered his hand from his sword. Instead, he crossed his legs. Maybe because he had said he was going to rest, maybe because they were all busy with other things, or maybe because they sensed the old man on some subconscious level and were just as spooked by his unseen presence as Rhys had been, but regardless, there was no one else in the attic. It was just him, all alone, and the old man. Perfect for chatting. Why are you following me around? He asked, cutting to the chase. Following you around. What a descriptor. I would say, rather, that you were dragging me around. Rhys thought for a second, processing the man's words, then looked up sharply. You mean something about me is pulling you after me? The old man nodded. Quite so. He frowned. But, I only saw you for the first time in the forest, by the impure well. Were you just hanging out there? Waiting for someone? Or, if I really was dragging you, did I encounter you somewhere else, and only see you for the first time there? The old man shrugged. I can't say. I was asleep for a long time, and I'm not quite sure where I was while I was sleeping. I woke up there for the first time, but that's not to say that was the place you encountered me. Rhys frowned. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it did make sense. He could think of a dozen places he might have picked up a scrap of a remnant weapon. The mine, Ernesto's lab, the library, the sewers, there were so many that he couldn't even start limiting it down. Plus, he'd interacted with all kinds of impure wells, where Sable had apparently hidden as a kid. In other words, remnant weapon dens, and with lots of curses, cursed people, and curse power, which were all associated with remnant weapons, too. If he had to guess, he'd pick Ernesto's lab as the place he'd picked this guy up, but he really couldn't say for sure. He felt like the kid with muddy hands, and the mom scolding him, trying to figure out where he'd gotten them only to realize that the entire world was basically a mud puddle waiting to happen. I guess I can't complain too much about playing in the mud and picking up a few bugs along the way, he thought to himself with a shrug. Rather than continue about worry about where he'd picked up the man, it was better to figure out what, and who, he was. You're not Sable's father, he guessed point blank. The man hadn't mauled him, hadn't even attempted a casual bite, so he couldn't be Sable's father. The man blinked at him, then laughed. No, not quite. Not quite. Not at all, in fact. That's suspicious. Rhys eyed him, then sighed. There's no need to be mysterious. I'm already friends with the straw man and the crazy beast, or whatever Sable's dad is called, that guy's daughter. I don't have a problem with remnant weapons. Whoever you are, I won't be afraid of you or biased against you or anything. Doesn't matter what you did, what you do, just tell me the truth, and I'll be okay with it. I wouldn't be so sure about that. Okay, I take that back. If you keep up this mysterious act, I'm actually going to get pissed at you. The man sat back and crossed his arms. I understand being concerned about my presence, but grilling me on my identity is not the best use of our time. Then enlighten me. What is? As far as Rhys was concerned, the man's identity was pretty important, especially if they were metaphysically connected through some mysterious, unknown method that he couldn't personally detect. He'd quietly tried while he was questioning the man, but his mana senses had gotten nowhere. But if the man didn't feel like sharing, he really had no means to force him to confess. They couldn't touch one another, as far as Rhys was aware, and he couldn't otherwise force the man to answer any questions. He didn't know enough about him to know what he wanted, needed, or otherwise, to know what carrots and sticks he had at hand. He sighed. I need to give it time. He'll naturally come to trust me, or at worst, I'll understand him enough to know how to pull his levers and get an answer. It was weird that an immaterial ghost man attached to his body was being so cagey about his identity, but who knew? Maybe it was his one remaining pleasure in life, to be annoyingly mysterious to young mages. After all, he was an immaterial ghost man attached to Rhys. His life had to at least suck a little. The man nodded. Now you're asking the right questions. I possess a great deal of knowledge about this world and my personal path. If you continue to ask the right questions, you might even get some of it out of me. What's your personal path, that you think it's worth so much to me? I pursued, the void. Rhys reached into his robes and threw the small red book across the room. It passed through the man, hit the wall, and dropped to the ground. The man sighed and looked at the book. You should treat books with respect. He didn't disappear. Damn it. It was a decent guess, in Rhys's opinion. The little red book was a mysterious object that had semi-attached itself to him, that he didn't fully understand, that contained information about the void. It was only natural to assume that it was the link between him and the man, but if he wasn't even holding it and the man was still there, then it obviously wasn't the connector. Unless, he did say to keep asking the right questions. Is that the tether between us? The man laughed a little. The tether between us isn't something so crude and material. But it's related to the book. He lowered his head, acknowledging it. This guy really likes the mysterious elder bit. If trash was Rhys's thing, then he wasn't sure he trusted that this guy's thing was the void. His thing seemed to be, being a mysterious asshole for no reason. Rhys sighed. It was bound to happen eventually. He did attract trash, after all, and overly, unnecessarily mysterious elders were peak trash. Plus, the void seemed like the exact right thing to have a mysterious elder attached to it. Not only did he have the mysterious book, but the void itself was mysterious and poorly understood, and then on top of that, he struggled to fully comprehend it, meaning that he could have someone faff about mysteriously, and yet not comprehend everything he needed to even then. Rhys sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead. Nothing he could do about it. This was going to be his future, for the next little while, locked to this old guy who wanted nothing more than to be a mysterious asshole. Of course, thinking of it positively, this was exactly what he needed. An expert who knew more about the void. Even as mysterious and annoying as he was being, he could still be massively helpful to Rhys. Rhys shook his head, adjusting his thinking, and sat up straighter. So, you're an expert on the void. That is correct. What is it? The void, I mean. A question I continue to ponder. Rhys frowned at the man, then rolled his eyes at himself a second later. If this man's path was the void, then of course he wouldn't have a straight answer for that. It was the same concept as the fact that when you got closer to a source of light, your shadow got darker. The longer you spent contemplating and coming to understand anything, the less certain it became in your heart. It was even true in the real world. People who knew nothing about math would tell you 1 + 1 = 2, and that was all there was to it, but true math majors would argue that 1 to the death, find the need to prove that it was true, and might even go looking for ways to prove it was false, just to better understand the concept of numbers. Physics, chemistry, any science, really, from far away, it was simple, but from close up, even the simplest concepts became a jumbled mess that was hard to understand, let alone explain. If the old man asked him to explain trash, he didn't know what he'd say. He had to listen to the old man's advice, and ask better questions. What's your name? Can I get a name, at least? The old man thought for a moment. You can call me Desmond. That is not his name, Rhys thought, but nodded anyways. At least he had something to call the guy, even if it was blatantly a false name. Better than thinking of him as, old man, all the time. I'm Rhys, he introduced himself. I know. I'm just trying to be friendly. Rhys resisted the urge to roll his eyes for a second time in 5 minutes. He simply did not get along with this guy. They were completely, totally incompatible, and there was nothing he could do about that. He just had to push through and learn what he could anyways. Just because they didn't get along, didn't mean they couldn't work with one another. What do you want? If I understand, I'd be happy to help you. You cannot achieve what I want. Another eye roll urge. Deep breaths, Rhys. You know you don't like this guy. Fight through it. Then, is all you want to do, answer my questions. No. Rhys's hand clenched. Would it kill this guy to be slightly helpful? He took a deep breath. But our relationship can be summarized by an exchange of information. I suppose, in a narrow-minded light. Yep, that's me, narrow-minded trash. He didn't really know why this guy got under his skin so much, aside from the man being an asshole in general, but boy did he. He shook his head, trying yet again to reset his mentality, then focused on the questions he had about the void. He'd just ask them and get out. If he expected nothing from this man, then he wouldn't be disappointed when the man gave nothing. From a certain perspective, the man was doing him a favor answering questions at all. After all, Desmond didn't owe Rhys anything. He knew he should be grateful, and he acknowledged that, but man did Desmond get under his skin regardless. What could he say? He really was the kind of trashy guy who could resent a professor for having a bad personality, while acknowledging that he was freely benefiting from the class and that the professor owed him nothing, not even answers. He wasn't trashy enough to take it out on Desmond, that was where he drew the line, but it didn't mean he'd like the guy, either. He focused on the most important questions he had about the void and asked Desmond question after question, refusing to give up even when Desmond deflected or ignored his queries. It wasn't easy to understand the void, and it was equally as hard to understand Desmond, but Rhys pushed through. Slowly, his understanding of the void increased. At last, Desmond shut his eyes. That's enough for today. Are you tired? Rhys asked, hoping to probe a tiny bit more information on what the man was. Rather than responding, Desmond vanished. Rhys stared at the space where he'd been, not angry, not even annoyed, just tired. Typical. I feel like I need to go right back to bed after that morning, Rhys thought, but reluctantly climbed to his feet anyways. He had work to do, and there was no time like the present. Despite all his frustration, his comprehension of the void had improved, and he was actually grateful for Desmond's efforts, but he dearly wished the man would deliver his messages in a less annoying format. Can't have everything, I guess. With that resolution in his heart, he headed for the door. Downstairs, Rhys immediately got to work. Their new influx of workers needed to be familiarized and put to work on the farms, or in the shops. Unfortunately, they all had to be back-of-shop workers. His efforts were too flashy this time to risk showing their faces around random Empire cities, when he couldn't be there to protect them or turn aside worries. Fortunately, none of them seemed too bothered by this turn of events. Mouse scurried off to pick up new tomes from the library, and Rhys gave Lyra enough of the shop's profits to buy good weapons and armor for everyone. The shop wasn't hurting, it was a current fad in several cities, and doing good business in the rest of them where it wasn't a fad yet, or its fad had already passed. The mages and ex-mages trained, and Rhys expanded the shop, growing into several more cities the above-board way. He was probably committing some form of tax fraud, but aside from that, the shop was completely good to go, and since he'd never liked paying taxes and especially didn't like the Empire, he was okay with getting away with that for as long as he could. True, taxes were how they got Al Capone, but 1, he wasn't Al Capone, and 2, he was pretty sure the Empire's IRS equivalent was the least of his worries when it came to battling the Empire. In the worst case, he could go ahead and directly battle the taxman, if he needed to, and that was assuming they even came after him. The Empire was a sprawling construct with thousands of businesses. Would they even notice a tiny little snack shack like his? Tax evasion aside, there was plenty to do around the area, and personally, to prepare for his impending wide-ranging attack on the criminal association who had opposed his expanding business, and were likely to continue to oppose it. Their cores belonged to him, whether they liked it or not. Honestly, at this point, their criminal activity was an excuse he was using to justify harvesting their cores. He wasn't afraid to confront it head-on. But, so what? They were justifying selling drugs and people and all kinds of other criminal activity for the ends of their own personal wealth, so why couldn't he kill them and harvest their cores for the betterment of others? Killing a killer didn't decrease the number of killers, but his track record for killing killers was pretty good at this point. That whole concept seemed a little silly in this world, that one person shouldn't kill another because there wouldn't be fewer killers afterwards, ? He'd never really got the point in the first place, and he really didn't get it now. After all, he could kill someone now and keep them from killing for 500 plus more years. Hell, he could proactively prevent someone morally heinous from becoming immortal by killing them now. It was always sorta a funky and weak moral argument in the first place, but introducing immortality really throws the balance straight into hell, he reflected, pinching his chin. In fact, he could even see using that argument in this sort of world to justify murder, rather than the opposite. No fewer killers, sure, but one fewer immortal killer, and that was enough. Then again, maybe he was biased, since he was a killer himself, now. A serial killer, even. In any case, it wasn't like winning the moral argument would win a battle, let alone a war, so he put it on the back burner for now. Between morning conversations with Desmond and wandering around in search of impure wells, his power grew evenly, if not at a precipitous rate. More than once, he thought back to that mine, the one which had challenged his impurity-resisting abilities, but he always forced himself to put it away for the moment. He couldn't get distracted by something that would get him caught by the Empire, even if it was probably a great way to get stronger for him. Still, there was something to be said for the slow, steady grind, even if he didn't make any particular jumps in power or standout comprehensions. The other mages benefited the most from the time to recover and rediscover their skills, more than Rhys did, and his business also benefited, continuing to grow. The Empire was in a tizzy from his raid, but no one suspected the chip's shop, and Rhys kept his and everyone else's heads down and kept them laying low, so that the Empire overlooked them in the sweep. He knew that the Infernan man, Uncle whatever the hell, might recognize him, so he only went out in disguise as Rhys MacDonald, with his black face smear and red and yellow regalia. It was a masterstroke to disguise while he was at the shop, rather than while he was fighting, in his opinion. Costumes were hot, heavy, annoying to wear, and usually gave him a headache. If he wore one while he was fighting, he'd have to worry about, i.e., keeping it out of flames, worry about the wear on his stamina and the pain of it, and have to constantly repair it out of combat. There was a reason why a certain friendly spider person spent half his episodes fixing his costume, and Rhys was a one-and-done kind of guy, not the kind of dude who wanted to constantly repair and upgrade costumes. When he finished a cosplay, that was it. Accomplishment achieved, on to the next. Only madmen wore costumes to fights, where the delicate things might get ripped, torn, or worse, stained. To his surprise, the criminals did not immediately retaliate for his attack on their base. Did they understand that his attack was measured retaliation for their killing of Leonard, or were they simply cooking up more? In any case, he kept everyone on high alert, not that they weren't already on high alert from the Empire scouring its lands for the people who'd hammered their camps, and then realized the true masterstroke of straightery that he'd delivered. Step 1. Attack the criminals. Step 2. Immediately pivot and attack the Empire. Step 3. The Empire was now pissed off, and looking for something or someone to blame. On top of that, they were aware of the criminal group, but not aware of Rhys's group. Step 4. The criminal group wanted to retaliate, but couldn't make a big move, because of the Empire looking for a whipping boy and Rhys's group also laying low and not claiming responsibility for their attack. Step 5. Laugh at his masterful and totally intentional plan that worked out in his favor. A moment later, he sobered. In reality, he hadn't stopped the criminal group from counter-attacking, only delayed it. The second the Empire stopped looking for someone to blame, or, more realistically, picked some poor unrelated sod and blamed him for the attack, the criminal group would immediately make a move to destroy his small, totally non-criminal business which had done no wrong. And given that he hadn't actually had a measured reaction to their attack on his business, and had instead haired off and burned down one of their buildings after killing everyone associated with it, which was a marked escalation from the criminals, killing one of his men. They were almost certainly going to continue to escalate against him. Rather than sit back and wait for their attack, it would be better if he made the first move, but that meant closely watching the Empire so he knew exactly when they were no longer looking for a scapegoat. Which meant, Rhys pinched his chin. What, exactly? Engaging with high society. Has the time finally come? Is it time to crash a ball? It was an absolutely insane chain of thought, he had to admit it, but he wasn't going to win against an overwhelming force he had no right even struggling against like the Empire by thinking conventionally and following the rules. By the rules, he should be dead already, or at best, still locked in a mine, with no core, filling himself with impurities until he died a sad, lonely death in the depths of the mine. Thinking unconventionally was how he was going to win. Of course, such a set of actions couldn't be taken casually. Crashing a ball, or even getting an invite to a ball, meant inviting society's attention to him in his small snack shack, which he'd just gone over how he shouldn't do that due to the tax evasion. No, he shook his head. If he was going to do this, then he couldn't do it as Rhys Foundling, or even as Rhys MacDonald, or even Rend, but as someone else entirely. Someone completely disconnected from Rhys and everything he knew. Someone who belonged at a ball, whom no one would be surprised to see there, who had recently vanished with no explanation due to a certain someone, him, absorbing them into his core. Someone like Farron Infernon, or Adelise Infernon, or even Mr. Headache with AJ, which he probably shouldn't show up as thanks to not being able to remember his name, and also being a little attached to his hair. Too bad he hadn't. Wait. Hold on, did I get that wrong? Did I actually absorb it? I didn't take it, but, if I'm remembering right this time, then it's not like it was sitting there after I absorbed them, without their body in it. Was I a fool? Was I a fool, this whole time? He frowned, then put a hand to his chest, closing his eyes as he searched through the trash pile in his core. He'd absorbed them, so he should have it in there, somewhere. Aha! He pulled, and dragged a bright silver jumpsuit into reality. A smile appeared on his face. He did have it. He'd thought he hadn't taken it, but on second thought, he had taken it. It was just that it had also had her body inside of it, so he'd thought of it as Adelise, not Adelise's jumpsuit. Good thing he'd remembered, or else he would have overlooked it forever. Not that Adelise would go to a ball in her jumpsuit, but that wasn't the point. Her jumpsuit had a far more important quality, it had been skin-tight. In other words, he could seam rip it, and discover her exact bodily measurements, then recreate a dress costume to her exact proportions. He didn't know what her taste was, though he could guess it from the jumpsuit, assuming that wasn't just a safety measure, but as long as he wore something that was flattering on her, someone would simply assume that she'd changed her style to match what made her look good. If he brought Mouse, that should be enough to squeak in the door, munch on some finger food, and listen to the rumors. He simply had to pick a family that didn't know the Infernons well, but would be flattered to have one randomly show up. He twisted his lips. Damn, this idea requires a shit ton more effort than I thought it would. He really just wanted an excuse to go to a party and stunt on the Empire, but damn if it wasn't starting to sound like a whole-ass effort to get there. Rhys clenched his fist. And nothing worth doing was ever easy. This was a sign from the heavens that the Empire's parties were definitely worth attending. He'd been eating nothing for too long. It was time to rejuvenate his taste buds and have something delicious. Dancing was whatever, and music was fine, but what he really wanted was to eat something tasty. Sure, he could eat his fries, chips, and soda, and he did all the time, but there was something to be said for eating all fancy like every now and again. Caviar was a sometimes food for sure, but he would kill to taste the absolute apex of magical caviar. And that was just one kind of food. What about cakes, cookies, chocolates, and everything sweet? Alcohol, roasted chicken and smoked ribs. He'd come all the way over here to another world. Even if he spent most of his time in the trash, it didn't mean he wanted to spend his entire life in the trash without ever eating anything good. He wanted to experience all the good this world had to offer, too, its fine cuisine and fine music. Was it too much to ask for, to take a small break from the grind to impersonate a woman he'd killed and enjoy a little bit of his sworn enemy's finest food, drink, and music? Okay, maybe my motives sound a little deranged when I put them like that. Still, what a story it would be, if he pulled it off. Cross-dressing his way into his enemy's ball for the lulz, vital information so he could optimally crush his opponent criminal enterprise, he'd be able to tell that story for ages to come. If someone had a story like that in his world, it would be absolutely legendary. So, with only the purest motives at heart, Rhys set out to look fine and do crimes. It was shockingly easy to obtain information about the nobles, once Rhys started trying. He took a slot as a front man, and rotated through a few of his shops, listening to the people coming by to get their snacks and asking a few obtuse questions. People loved to gossip, and in this world, nobles were the equivalent of celebrities, so he heard so much gossip about them. With a few simple questions, he learned that Adelise was presumed dead, but that some people still thought she might be alive, and hiding out in the woods somewhere, licking her wounds. The Infernans were apparently a populous, but unpopular family, who held a great deal of power in the Empire, more than some people thought they should. Theron's death had barely resonated, since he was too weak to count for much in the family's overall strength, but Adelise's disappearance and presumed death had smarted. She was a Tier 4, after all, and there were only so many of those in the Empire. The Infernans apparently had 3 Tier 4s, and 2 Tier 5s, which made them a powerhouse within the Empire, but there were other houses that had 2 4s and at least 1 5s, or even more than 4 Tier 4s, though no Tier 5s, so if they'd lost their 3rd Tier 4, they'd face a great change in status within the Empire. Thus, the official Infernan family announcement was that Adelise was likely recovering so she could make it back to them in proper shape, even though the word on the street was that they secretly knew she was dead, and were covering up for it. No surprise there. He'd seen another Infernan on his way out. True, on his way out of a different camp, and true, he'd absorbed Adelise's body, but that man had, number 1, irrefutable proof that someone powerful had been at the camps attacking them, and number 2, was high enough tier to quickly cross the span between the camps and find no Adelise anywhere he could sense not long after he would have known Rhys had left. Rhys was willing to bet that the Infernans were completely convinced Adelise was dead, and only the most delusional of them would even hesitate to kill any Adeliseus they saw. They were only pretending she wasn't, to keep up the facade of being one of the strongest families in the Empire. It did beg the question of why they thought it was worth it to keep up a facade. Did they think no one else would see through it ever, or did they have a Tier 3 on the verge of breaking through that they thought they could break through before anyone found out they were down a Tier 4? He didn't know, but from what he'd seen of the family, he'd bet on the latter. They certainly weren't lacking in raw strength, which implied that they had a way to rapidly, at least on a mage timeline, if not outright, empower their mages. Of course, that part was less important to him. What mattered was that they were pretending it was possible that Adelise was still alive, which gave him just the opening he was looking for. Once he'd established that Adelise was an option in terms of cosplay, he turned to his next objective: whose ball did he crash, where was it, and when was it? He needed a family that was friendly with the Infernans, or better yet, wanted to gain Infernan favor, but wasn't so close that they actually knew anything about the Infernans. There were plenty of backwoods nobles that wouldn't know an Infernan from any other big city noble, and would just be happy to be graced by the presence of a high-ranking high-tier noble, but what was the point of going to a backwoods ball? He didn't need to crash the biggest or best ball of the season, but he didn't want to crash a piddling backwoods ball either that didn't even have good food, good knowledge of how the Empire worked and whether or not it was still looking for a particular set of independence fighters. No, he needed a ball that was at least in a small city. Fortunately, he also learned that the Infernans were based in the capital, which was a good sign to him that he ought to stay far, far away. Not that he was bold enough to expand into the Empire's seat of power yet, but he absolutely did not want to risk showing up at the same ball an actual Infernan did. If he stayed away from the capital, though, they shouldn't appear. Big-headed nobles who lived in the capital wouldn't deign to appear at any balls outside of the capital, surely. He'd have to keep an eye out for balls being held in the country homes of big nobles, but as long as he kept to big cities, stayed away from the capital, and avoided small families and country homes, it shouldn't be too hard to pull off, ignoring how many qualifiers he'd had to put on that statement, of course. You already know that the Empire is still looking for us. Do you really need to go to a ball? Lyra asked one day, when Rhys came back from his work on the front lines. Rhys dusted off his hands and glanced at her. No, but I want to. She rolled her eyes. Jeopardizing our plans for a party. No, you're not seeing this in the right light. This is invaluable data on our enemy, and on top of that, think about the psychological blow to the Infernans, the strongest supporters of the Empire. The psychological blow of showing up someplace none of them are, dressed up like a dead girl. Rhys spread his hands. It's the kind of behavior that drives people insane in classic literature. He did have to look to classic literature for this one, not trash literature, but he figured that one was outweighed by it being absolutely trash behavior. Still, in every piece of literature he could think of, ghostly figures of supposedly dead people, or even actual ghosts, would haunt families of power. There was only one outcome every time: the downfall and utter annihilation of the grand family being haunted. He wasn't actually a ghost, of course, but he could appear as a dead person and do the haunting part, and who knew? Maybe the family would fall apart on its own. Either way, he was willing to set the seeds for some truly powerful psychological damage later on, and regardless of how he looked at his impending adventure, it would be dangerous psychologically for any Infernan. The more he appeared as Adelice, the more damage it would do to the family, and the more damage he did to the family's mentality, the more rot he inflicted on the Empire. One crazy family at the heart of a powerful machine like a government could drive an entire country mad, and, well, he certainly wouldn't be helping with his impure food. It was like the fall of Rome. Give everyone lead poisoning, drive a few of the ruling families a little more crazy than usual, and bam, the empire collapsed. Of course, that was simplifying things a bit, and impurities weren't quite lead poisoning, but it wasn't a bad idea, all told. Even if he personally saw his impending outing and ball debut as a bit of a personal benefit for the boss, an end-of-year bonus for the CEO, if you would, it wasn't as if there was no benefit to their cause. Unlike paying CEOs multiple millions of dollars, this did actually forward their goals. It was a bit of a long shot, a bit of a low-probability attempt, but it was worth taking a few shots in the dark every now and again, just to see if they would pay off. If they never took risks, they'd never have made as much progress as they had. We're using classic literature as our guidelines for taking down the Empire. Lyra asked disbelievingly. I can't really explain Rome, so, yep. She crossed her arms. You're just looking for another excuse to dress like a girl. Rhys gave her a look, then sighed deeply and shook his head. No one respects crossplay these days. Everyone trying to politicize it, when all I wanna do is wear a skirt every now and again when the best designs are put on female bodies. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. You try wearing suits and trenchcoats and khakis for years when you're meant to be dressed up, and you'll start longing for the expressivity and detail put into female characters, too. Female characters. Rhys waved his hand. Don't worry about it. Impossible. I'm always worried about you. You worry about me. The same way I worry about puppies and infants. They evoke concern. Rhys put a hand to his cheek, touched. So I'm like a cute, helpless puppy to you. Concern, with a twinge of hunger. You need consent to vor someone. She looked at him. There are people who would let me eat them. The world is a wide, wide place. Rhys sighed. It's not even like I want to crossdress this time, you know. No. It's just, Farron's been gone for too long. Everyone knows he's dead. Headache Man had no hair, and I just can't go bald. Not even temporarily. Hair is a precious resource for men, Lyra. You women don't understand. The others, I don't even know their names. I don't know anything about their families or political standing. I've already done all this work. It's literally Adelise or no one. I mean, come on. If I could pick, I'd pick someone closer to my size. Her proportions are crazy, and she's taller than me. Skinner, too, and I don't know what I'm doing with my shoulders, because they're huge, and he gestured. Narrow. Pencil-shaped. I'm going to have to narrow my shoulders and widen my hips. My skeleton isn't built like that. I'm gonna be in so much pain. If it's going to be that bad, then what if you kidnapped another noble? You could even kidnap a man, Lyra suggested deadpan. I'm not that fragile about my masculinity. I can just cross-dress. It's not that big of a deal. You're going to get a reputation. I already have a reputation, so honestly, no loss. Wait, he squinted at her. How do you? She touched her nose. Oh, well, okay, fair. I guess I shouldn't underestimate an apex predator's sense of smell. They stood there for a few moments. Lyra seemed like she was thinking about something, so Rhys stood there quietly, letting her think. At last, she looked up. If you're really committed to this, I could share a few arts. Rhys blinked and tilted his head. You, know how to. Did you think we water sprites were born looking like this? I can teach you how to transform your body and face. Don't expect to be able to turn into a frog, but shifting your bone structure is very possible. Lyra, that would be awesome. Thank you so much, Rhys said, his eyes sparkling. He could already imagine the possibilities. Even if her technique only allowed a small tweak, he would be able to access all kinds of characters that were impossible for him before. If only he'd had such a skill in his first life, the things he could have accomplished, the characters he could have embodied, the contests he could have won. If I lost 200 pounds, he reminded himself, sobering a little. Lyra's skill could probably hide gills and fins, not vanish 300 pounds of body mass. Maybe he would have been more motivated to stay thin if he'd had a skill like that, though. For sure. You're not going to use this for evil, are you? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Don't you use this to eat people? Rhys pointed out. I don't want to enable a deviant, she replied, ignoring his question. He spread his hands and shrugged. I don't think I'm a bad person. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. That's true. You're literally surrounded by women who like you, and you haven't put a hand on any of them. What? Who? Who likes me? Rhys demanded, jolting. He looked around, as if they were going to materialize right this moment. Lyra rolled her eyes, then gestured. This way. It's easier if I teach you around water. Rhys followed her, only a little curious why they needed to be wet to learn shapeshifting. Lyra splashed down into the river, laying back and splaying in the water. Her hair and clothes flowed around her, pitch-black hair billowing around the white cloth as it welled up like the water that supported it, her pale skin barely a shade darker, her lips like a smear of lurid blood. Rhys froze where he stood, struck by the urge to freeze the moment, immortalize it somehow, but then she sat up and gave him a look. What? Get in the water already. Gods know you could use a bath. Should I leave my clothes on? Rhys asked. Wearing ankle and wrist-length clothes seemed likely to impede learning how to transform his body, but maybe that was just him. That's your call. He left his clothes on and walked into the water. If it was all the same, then he'd rather not get naked in front of a predator, thanks. The water was cool, and his clothes flowed around him, first floating on the water, then sucking tight to his body, then flowing free again as he moved and parts of him shifted in and out of the water. He didn't plop down like Lyra, but remained standing, waiting for her instruction. Instead, she ducked underwater. There was swift motion, and she vanished, like a fish in the sun. Rhys blinked, looking around, only for two strong, wet hands to wrap around his shoulders and push him under. He splashed down and broke the surface with a gasp, and Lyra swam back around in front of him, far more pleased. There. That's more like it. You could have asked. She shook her head. Once more, she vanished underwater, and this time, she only resurfaced her eyes, leaving the rest underwater. Her skin took on an even whiter pallor, more akin to fish belly than human skin, and there was a silver sheen to it, to boot. He wasn't sure, but he thought he saw fins and webbed hands beneath the water. Promise not to scream, Lyra asked, lifting her mouth over the water to speak. Her lips were thin, now, like a fish's, and her teeth needle-like and sharp. Yep, Rhys said, giving her an enthusiastic thumbs up. This whole time, he'd been deprived of cat-eared girls, and though Fish Girl wasn't quite on his top 10 Mimi girl list, mermaids were still peak aesthetic. Who didn't want to see a real-life mermaid? Even if she was a little scary, that only added to the fun, in Rhys's opinion. Overly polished monster girls with perfect teeth, flawless skin, and perfectly human proportions except for their ears and tails were fine for gooners, but true gentlemen appreciated the raw fertility of a true monster girl, too. There was something about claws and fangs that added just enough edge to really pique one's interest, and the little details to point out that this wasn't just some ordinary human always made the flavor a bit stronger. Now, true, vanilla was the most popular flavor for a reason, but Rhys was an expeditionist who had sampled almost every flavor his world had to offer. If ordinary women were vanilla, then ordinary mermaids were like chocolate. Chocolate was classic, but once you got into the stranger chocolate banana pistachio raspberry combinations, that was where the excitement lived. They wouldn't always work, and sometimes they'd totally flop, but at least he'd gotten to taste something new. Lyra hesitated one more moment, then stood. Her skin was pale and shiny all over, shiny like a fish. Spiky fins poked out of her forearms and her back, the fins spoke like a wheel or a dragon's wing. They were white, mottled with black spots, and darkened to crimson at the very tips. Her legs were also adorned with fins, and her feet were large, webbed fins, not unlike a pair of flippers. Her face was slightly distorted, her jaw larger and longer, and her teeth protruded from those thinner lips. Gill slits in her neck fluttered, showing dark red underneath. Rhys nodded. He wasn't sure it was an improvement over the typical mermaid, but it was neat looking. Lyra pulled it off, for sure. He liked normal Lyra better, but this Lyra was good too. What do you think? She asked. I think you look cool, Rhys replied. She snorted. At least it's not some cheesy line about how I look even better like this. What, did you expect that? I can say something like that if you want. Nah, I ate the last guy who tried that bullshit. I know this appearance isn't to human tastes, so don't lie to me. Rhys shrugged. Some people like that kind of stuff. You never know. He might have just had weird tastes. If that's the case, then I feel even more justified for eating him, she declared, grinning evilly. Rhys tilted his head. Do you not like this appearance? You seem completely convinced that no one could like it. I don't feel anything about it, I just know enough about humans to know you fools don't appreciate good scales. I'm considered attractive among water sprites in this form, so there's no reason not to like it. Fair enough. It wasn't like Rhys put great emphasis on whether or not he was attractive to fish, so why would Lyra care if humans liked her fishy form? If fish loved her and men feared her, that was just part of the water-bound apex predator skillset. He gave Lyra a thumbs up. I've got an idea for a hat that you're going to love. I highly doubt that. Listen, this technique requires you to be wet. That's its greatest strength, and its greatest weakness. You'll need to find water to change forms. That's not too bad. It wasn't like another series he could think of where it was the temperature of the water that determined the main character's shape. All he needed was water, and he could be whatever he wanted. She ducked under the water again, and emerged as the Lyra he'd come to know. Lay back in the water. Your ears have to be submerged, or else you won't be able to comprehend this skill. Rhys raised his brows. That wasn't what he'd expected to hear, but on the other hand, he had a book that only made sense when he read it in proximity to the void. Maybe he shouldn't laugh it off. Obediently, he laid back in the water and spread his arms, floating in the water. Lyra lowered into the water, then vanished underneath. He couldn't see her anymore. Every instinct prickled against his skin, urging him to sit up and look around, to find where the dangerous fish demon had gone before she pulled him under the water, wrapped her slimy fingers around her neck, and killed him, or simply took a big bite out of the idiot floating stupidly in the water, but he forced himself to lay flat and float placidly, as though he wasn't thinking about how many different ways Lyra could kill him. A strange sound echoed in his ears. Muffled at first, it slowly grew clearer, until meaning unfolded in his mind. He laid there, letting the water flow over him and listening to Lyra's voice, and slowly, he merged with the water. He was soft, malleable, a flowing substance that could move over, around, past anything. A shapeless thing that took on whatever form it was given. And what form was it given? The form of the container that held it. Like how mana took on the shape of a core, he could use mana to give himself a new shape, then flow into it. The only limitation was that he wasn't a very good fluid. He had limits. Limits that were so low that he found them deeply disappointing. He couldn't change his general dimensions, but he could mold parts of himself, change the details of his figure and the finer points of his facial bones. An image welled up in his mind, and he shifted to take on that image. His bones and flesh took on a new shape, then went still, firming in their new locations. The murmuring in his ear stopped. Rhys blinked. When had it gotten so dark? How long had he been lying here? He sat up, putting his feet on the ground, and looked at his hands, expecting to see pruny fingers, but instead saw long, slender fingers that didn't belong to him. He turned his hands over, then checked his arms, patting his ribs to feel his new shape. Far narrower than he'd been, with a dynamic hourglass figure, no boobs, and he was definitely still a man, but he was a supermodel of a man, with unrealistically incredible hips and a far more delicate structure than he'd ever had until now. "Damn, I'm hot," Rhys said appreciatively, looking himself over. Lyra snorted. She looked the way he was used to her looking again, more human than humanoid, all the teeth and fins put back away. "Do I need to give you a moment?" No, I'm not that excited about my new face," he said, then paused. "Is that normal?" "No." Rhys sighed in relief. "Thank goodness. The upside to this technique is that, unlike illusions or temporary physical distortions, this technique allows you to truly reshape your body. If you're knocked unconscious or run out of mana, you will maintain this form. The downside is that until you're proficient, you'll need to enter the water to use this, and that it takes more mana up front to change your shape. It's unpopular among human mages, from what I understand, and even among monsters, it's fallen out of favor since it's so slow to activate, and most monsters don't like water as much as, well, water sprites." "Oh, that makes sense," Rhys said. "Explains why I learned it so easily, anyways, if it's considered a trash technique. I wasn't expecting you to take all day to learn it, but I suppose you aren't a water sprite." "Never mind, I guess I didn't learn it easily. It only felt that way because he had gone into a trance and not felt the time pass, not because he'd actually learned it quickly." He glanced up at the sky again. It was dark, truly dark. Not sunset or twilight, but dark. He'd really spent the whole day floating in the water, focusing on learning a single skill. Speaking of, he eyed the message floating in the corner of his vision. Body Transformation LVL1. The skill had an underwhelming name, but he was pleased with the results. The water-based requirement to activate the skill was a little weird, but then, what had he expected from a skill taught by the water sprite? He'd known going in that she required an anti-umbrella at all times just to function comfortably. Besides, the skill not deactivating when he was knocked unconscious or ran out of mana was nice. It meant he could rely on it even in battle or dangerous circumstances, whereas some kind of illusion magic was far less reliable. Hell, illusion magic could probably be pretty easily detected and dispelled, whereas this, he scanned himself, but sensed no magic aside from his usual trash star and mana flows. It wasn't magic. Not anymore, anyways. It was a light switch, not a match. He flipped it on, and became, well, not Adelise, but far closer to her bone structure. He flipped it off, and became Rhys again. While it was turned either way, whether the light was on or not, the light switch itself was inert, unlike the match, which would burn the whole time it was providing light. It wasn't the best metaphor, since electrons would be flowing to the bulb and all that, but as long as he limited his thoughts to the switch itself, it made enough sense. Though, I might just leave this on all the time. Well, maybe not this, but, he looked himself over again. He'd been going for Adelise, so he was all narrow and slender, but if he went back in the water, made a few fixes, adjusted his flaws into something less, well, flawed, then. Lyra snorted. I know that look. What look? Rhys said, quickly schooling his features into something neutral. The, ooh, if I just fixed this and that, look. Don't worry. I've been there. We all have. Right. I should, be myself, and. Lyra's scathing look interrupted him. No. Why would I tell you that? Do you think I was born looking like this? You know I wasn't. True, Rhys allowed. She doesn't seem much into that, be yourself, garbage, anyways. More of a, be what you want to be, kind of person. Shouldn't have expected her to stop me from body modding myself. I was going to caution you to take it slow and spend time experimenting with little fixes before you settle into anything extravagant. Every young water sprite spends their adolescence with some kind of ridiculous proportions according to what they find most sexually attractive, and they all look like idiots. I wouldn't want you to go flaunting around with a python between your legs, tripping over your own length. We water sprites are used to that, and we take that behavior in stride as a part of growing up, but humans might be a little unsettled if you suddenly return with a huge bulge in your robes. A python? Rhys choked, taken aback. He stumbled back, then caught himself, struggling to put his face back to neutral. His mind hadn't even gone there, but now that she'd pointed it out, it was all he could think about. How big could he go? No, wait, maybe that was one place he should stick to being himself. Or, well, since he could transform now, why couldn't he? Anything over 10 inches, and you might pass out. Fair warning. With that, Lyra flaunted away. Rhys stared after her. At last, when she was long gone, he shook his head and sighed aloud. He should definitely just be himself when he wasn't impersonating someone. Just, be himself. Definitely. 100%. Maybe just one more inch. Rhys smacked himself on the cheek and hurried away from the water before he dropped back into it to play around. Now wasn't the time. He had a resistance to run, a snack shop to operate, and a ball to crash as the ghostly figure of a powerful family's dead daughter in a twist worthy of the bard himself. He could mess around with inches later. At last, the time was upon them. The day had come. The dawn broke, and the sun shone upon a new day. The day of the ball. He'd found one. It was in a little city far from the capital, not far from the city he'd started in, but not the actual city he'd started in case the Empire was tracking that, on the off chance they connected the mysterious bald ghost he was about to be, and the revolution. They were still looking for the revolution, and patrols prowled all the cities near the camps he'd struck, but this city was just far enough away that the patrols were lax and somewhat lackluster, composted of the guards who'd pissed off their commanders and slacked off a little too much on their regular duties rather than actually skilled guards. Not that he expected the patrols to stop a noblewoman on her way to the ball, but it was better safe than sorry. Remember, Mouse, we're doing this for the revolution. We're going to gain information on our foes, so we can strike first against the criminals, gain lots of cores, and ultimately overwhelm the Empire with our overwhelming might and/or junk food-induced impurities, Rhys said, putting his hands on his hips. With his new bone structure and the help of a generously stuffed corset, Rhys was the splitting image of Adelise, as he remembered her in the dark, lit weirdly by fire and garbage fires, in the heat of battle. He planned to stick to the shadows, emerge to grab food when the coast was clear, then retreat to the darkness. His primary objective was truly, earnestly, to discover the state of the Empire, but his secondary objective was absolutely to discover what high cuisine was like in the Empire. It was nearly as important as his primary objective. Almost. He wore a dark blue gown that wasn't too nice, or too understated. He'd chosen dark blue for two reasons. 1, he could blend into the shadows, and 2, red hair looked good in blue, so it was probably an acceptable color for Adelise to wear. He was pretty sure she wasn't flaunting around in silver at all hours, and besides, silver was an impossible color to vanish in. Dark blue was far easier to deal with, whether it was blending into the crowd or escaping from the entire situation. Mouse cringed beside him. She wore a mousy brown uniform that was what Rhys imagined servants wore in this kind of world. It was a nice outfit, anyways. Not quite French-made, but then, he hadn't wanted to go nuts before he knew what the standards were. He was pretty sure nobles didn't bring their maids out of the house, anyways. Is this really necessary? She squeaked nervously, peering around her. They were currently standing by the side of the path that led to the house of the nobles who were holding the ball. They didn't have an invite, after all, and Rhys didn't want to depend on Mouse's semi-invisibility too much. Hence, they were going to steal an invitation. He still hadn't decided if the person he stole it from was going to disappear, or if they'd just take a nice long nap and hopefully get memory obfuscated by Mouse's passive power. Depended on their personality, he supposed, and whether they seemed cool or not. Do you think you can sneak us in without an invite? Rhys asked. Mouse licked her lips. Maybe. Let's get that invite, then. I didn't mean. Mouse fell silent for a moment, then sighed. It is really necessary. It's a masterstroke of psychological warfare that always works in classical novels, which, when you think about it, are considered trash by everyone but English teachers nowadays, which means it'll definitely work. What's English? Language. I missaid language. Oh. Wheels rattled. Rhys looked up sharply, slightly adjusting his pose so that the tree perfectly covered him. Mouse edged a little closer, to ensure that her invisibility aura covered him, too. They waited, holding their breath. This wasn't the first carriage. The catering carriages had come and gone, and Rhys had let them. There was no need to interrupt some earnest workers just trying to do their jobs, though he had been tempted to hijack a carriage and impurify all the food inside. Ideas for later, but for now, he didn't want to mug the hard-working ordinary citizens who didn't deserve that kind of shit. An extremely grand carriage had rolled through not long ago, and despite his eat the rich philosophy, he let it go. If there was someone that important coming to this small ball, then they would almost certainly be accounted for and expected, and if they didn't show up, the hosts would start looking around to figure out what happened to them. In other words, exactly what he didn't want. That was the kind of attention to the guest list that would get him, 1, kicked out, and 2, would end the ruse while it was still just a silly prank and wasn't a psychological attack yet. Plus, he'd sensed a Tier 4 emanation from the carriage. Not that he couldn't take on a Tier 4, but the battle would be dangerous, and it would be big, flashy, and noisy, all things he also didn't need. I guess we should eventually level up Mouse's techniques so we can slip in without deleting someone from the guest list. It wouldn't be too standout for someone to not show up to any given party. Gods knew Rhys had no-showed enough invites in his first life, but if it became a pattern, people might stop suspecting ghosts and start suspecting ordinary foul play. Especially if the no-shows ended up pulling a permanent no-show, as opposed to simply skipping a party. The latest carriage rattled into view. This one was nice, but not overly nice. Black shiny outside, the edges and doors graced with a hint of decorative silver, the horses tall and black to match the carriage. The driver sat with a tall back, his top hat silken, a mask obscuring his face. Rhys watched it come, a bit curious. It seemed like carriages were in style in the Empire, as opposed to flying boats or swords, or any other majorly form of transport. According to the people he'd spoken to, the Empress appreciated a nice slow journey by the old ways, traveling between places by land and truly seeing the countryside and the people for what they were, and so, the nobles, meaning to emulate the Empress in all things, had adopted her practice for their own. The less charitable amongst his customers had chalked it up to the Empress having a crippling fear of heights, which Rhys was pretty sure was bullshit. She certainly hadn't flinched when she was up on her giant ships in the sky. Honestly, he kind of understood the policy. It meant ordinary mages and citizens saw the nobles more often and saw what they could aspire to. On the other hand, it also meant the nobles were forced to keep an eye on the status of the countryside, whether that meant looking out for dissenters or seeing that the ordinary citizens had had a bad harvest and really couldn't pay their taxes. If they simply floated around all over the place, they'd become completely detached from the people around them, and the empire would be in a much worse state than it was right now. It didn't stop people from using flying swords and flying ships, and he'd certainly seen plenty around, but for formal engagements like balls, it was stylish to show up in a carriage, even if that meant flying to the local city, then renting a carriage to the venue. He appreciated the practice. In any case, it was easier to ambush someone on the ground, and it meant he didn't have to worry about procuring flying swords as well as everything else he'd had to gather for tonight's heist. It was a good social practice that he intended to exploit to hell and use for all it was worth against the Empire itself. He extended his aura, sweeping the carriage for a split second. Tier 3, and only one of them. The driver was Tier 1, and aside from that, the man was alone in the carriage. Rhys nodded at Mouse. Go. Mouse bit her lip, but she didn't hesitate. She darted out and attacked the driver from behind, knocking him out in a grim imitation of the way Bast had knocked her out repeatedly back during the tournament. The man slumped, then vanished right out of his seat as Mouse dashed off with him. Without anyone driving them, the horses slowed. Rhys jumped out in front of them, and they came to a halt, unwilling to run him down. He strode forward, heading for the doors. Before he got there, they slammed open, thrown wide by a meaty hand. Without even looking out, the man inside shouted, "What's the hold up, him? We're going to be late if you keep this up. And you know what that means. 5 less gold for every minute we're late." Rhys raised his brows. Was this man literally doing the, put down $10 in ones on the table, then take one away every time the waiter makes a mistake, technique, except to this poor driver? That made up his mind. This man was about to exit the guest list permanently. "So sorry, sir. There's a branch on the road. I'll have to clear the way," Rhys said in his best stuffy servant voice. He must have been close enough to the servant's voice, because the man grunted. "Be quick about it. I cannot be late. Lord de Vere's perfect record cannot be stained." Rhys drew out filthy gas from his trash star and rolled it into a ball in his hand. He added more and more, compressing it into a tight marble. More and more, until the marble transformed from a murky brown to pitch black. "What's taking so long? Lord de Vere," or so Rhys assumed, complained. "It'll only be a moment longer, sir," Rhys assured him, then tossed the bead of ultra-compressed trash gas into the carriage and slammed the door shut. The second the door closed, he released his hold on the marble, and it burst, filling the carriage with gas. Lord de Vere's lunged for the door, but Rhys held it shut. He went for the other door, and Rhys heard a grunt and a thump as someone else held it shut on the other side. "Mouse." "Yeah," Mouse replied, clearly struggling to hold the door. "If the door pops open, flee and let me deal with it," Rhys told her, but didn't tell her to get away otherwise. If they could gas this guy to death, that was one problem dealt with quietly, easily, and simply, with no damage to the carriage or any unnecessary noise or mana. He'd been planning to weaken the guy, then lunge for it and hammer him when he came out the opposite door weak and injured, but with Mouse's cooperation, it seemed like even that much planning had been unnecessary. The slamming on the door weakened, then silenced. Rhys held the door for another few seconds just to be sure, then opened his door just a crack and absorbed all the gas back into himself. Only when he was sure it was safe did he throw the door open and step inside. Lord de Vere slumped against the seat, eyes rolled back in his head, foaming at the mouth. He was a portly man, and the slender, gilded sword at his hip was clearly more for fashion than battle. Rhys absorbed him and his energy, and was shocked at how easily he absorbed the man. Then again, he hadn't seriously fought back, and had been so easy to overpower that even Mouse had been able to hold the door shut against him. He was clearly someone who had been given his core, not someone who'd fought hard and deserved it. The Empire's meritocracy, at its finest. No nepotism here, no siree. Rhys paused a moment, searching inside himself, then held out his hand. The invitation appeared out of his core and landed in his hand. He climbed in and pushed the door on the other side open, grinning at a startled Mouse. "Hop up front, driver. Let's head to the ball." Mouse gave him a timid smile, then reached behind her and pulled a top hat out of seemingly nowhere. "Why yes, sir." Rhys chuckled. He closed the doors and settled in. The carriage creaked as Mouse climbed up front, and there was a crack of the reins as they set off once more, as if nothing had happened. It was time to become the phantom of the ball. In the back of the carriage, Rhys quickly drew all the curtains and pulled all the slots shut. He was very clearly not Lord de Vere's, and didn't want to get called out on it, but based on the man's lazy demeanor, he might just be able to get away with it this way. They slowed down, and Rhys heard a voice from outside the carriage. "Invitation, please." Rhys slid open the slit between him and the driver and pushed the invitation through, nudging Mouse with it so she'd know to turn. She took it from him, and he slammed the slit shut before anyone could angle to see in. There was a pause, then a crinkle of paper and a low hum. "Lord de Vere's, is it? You're not his usual driver." The usual driver was indisposed. The other voice grunted. "Hit the liquor, did he? As many times as he rolled up here reeking of the stuff, I'm not surprised. Go on through." There was a nervous squeak that sounded a lot like Mouse generically agreeing, and the carriage rolled on. Inside, Rhys let out a breath. The second hurdle cleared. He'd been a little worried about Mouse bluffing, given how nervous she was on a good day, but it seemed like the man had correctly read her nervousness as a nervous personality, rather than an indication of wrongdoing. Mouse drove the carriage on, toward the grand entrance, their next hurdle. Obviously, he couldn't stay in the carriage. That was where people left their carriages, after all, and entered the house. His invitation was for Lord de Vere's, and he was very visibly not Lord de Vere's. He wasn't worried about the guard behind them. That guy was busy with the rest of the carriages. It was the announcer and the servants at the gates who concerned him. Which was why they'd be relying on Mouse for this next part. Rhys edged toward the door and waited there. The door creaked open, and Mouse appeared, timid as ever. She offered her hand to Rhys, and he took it. He felt himself fade a little, as if reality stopped paying as much attention to him. It was as if he went from the player character in a video game with high polygon textures and love and attention put into his accessories and abilities, to a low polygon background NPC. People were moving all over the place, dismounting, reaching for their servants, fixing up their outfits and explaining details to the house's servants. Mouse took the lead, and they slipped through the chaos, so unremarkable that no one could spare the time to look their way. They were too busy with someone else. Another servant would tend to that particular pair of nobles. It wasn't that they turned invisible, or that no one looked their way, they just assumed that someone else was handling it, or were too busy with their own jobs, or saw that they knew what to do and thought they'd already been taken care of. The carriage rattled on as the horses followed the horses ahead of them, and the servants turned to the next carriage as if it were natural to totally skip a carriage. Mouse and Rhys quietly walked up the stairs, melding in with the crowd. At the top of the stairs, a crier awaited. As each noble approached, they handed off their invitation, and the crier announced their arrival. Rhys expected Mouse to swerve around the line entirely, but instead, she obediently joined the line. Slowly, it crept toward the crier. One noble group at a time, they approached the man. Rhys glanced at Mouse, but her eyes were intent, her whole being focused. He raised his brows. She was locked in. It'd be rude to interrupt her now. Closer and closer. At last, there was only one group between them and the man. The crier turned to take their invite, and something shifted in the world. The paper slipped through the nobleman's hand. Both he and the crier jumped to pick it up and bumped into one another, and the nobleman's wife chuckled. Mouse tugged Rhys's arm. In that moment, no one was looking at the two of them. Rhys followed her lead, and they slipped past the crier into the ball. But it's the grand entrance. There's no way we can enter unseen, Rhys thought to himself. Not that it mattered, he figured the nobles wouldn't be paying that much attention to the other nobles entering the room, but as they crested the stairs, music suddenly swelled. Rhys stepped into the room to find every noble's back to him as they all turned to watch the musicians play their first song. Mouse tugged at him again, scurrying down the stairs, and Rhys followed, incredibly impressed with her path. Not for the first time, he looked at her in a new light. Her skills were even more powerful than his, when seen in a certain light. Everything he could do, he had to touch or interact with in some way. Mouse, on the other hand, had just affected the entire world around her without touching a single thing in the ball. She'd never been to this place before, and she'd never seen these people before, but she'd influenced them with her path so that they all looked away anyways. True, she probably saw it as, I've become so unremarkable that no one pays attention to me, like when he'd been in high school and wished deeply to vanish, but the effect was that she altered the entire world around her to make her less visible. They stepped onto the dance floor, and Mouse let out a little sigh. People started looking around normally again, instead of aggressively looking away from them, and Rhys felt his polygons come back, or at least, that was how it felt. As if he snapped back into vision, and became clear and visible again. He glanced around. A few of the nobles eyed him up. One or two even turned and stared in shock or suspicion. Rhys faded back to the edges of the party. He didn't want to be unnoticed now, the way Mouse could make him. No, he wanted to be just unnoticed enough that no one confronted him, but noticed enough that they grew suspicious. Mouse, on the other hand, went back to being her normal level of invisible and wandered the crowd. While he played the karmic ghost, it was Mouse's job to listen and gain information. Yes, that's right. I need to be subtle, sneaky. He edged toward the buffet table and snatched a few finger foods. Taking only a moment to marvel at the sheen on the quiche/egg tart he'd grabbed, he tossed it back. Umami. Edginess. It melted on his tongue, melding perfectly with the flaky pastry crust. A tomato burst in his mouth, melding with the egg and the cheese, is that Gouda, and a hint of savory spinach. Perfectly balanced, with just enough acid to cut the fat in the cheese and egg without overcoming it with the sharp sweetness of the tomato. He'd never been a big vegetables guy, but this was beyond delicious. This was culinary masterwork. He'd never understood why people would pay $500 or more to eat tiny bites of unfilling food, but this egg tart was a masterclass in why he should have done that at least once in his first life. And that was but the first bite. He eyed up the rest of the buffet as he stuffed his first round in his face. Oh, he wouldn't be moving from this spot all night. Excuse me. A nobleman gestured at the food, politely asking him to keep moving without saying it aloud. Rhys glanced up and nodded, then wandered on, leaving the food table behind. Internally, he grumbled, but externally, he understood. He couldn't bogart the food table all day without being super obvious. He needed to hide a little, not become the fatty who loomed over the buffet all night, no matter how much he wanted to be that fatty. Ah, well, it was fine. He could keep circling. Although, he glanced up at the balconies over the ball. Right now, he was just some chick that looked kind of like Adelise. If he appeared mysteriously on those balconies at a pivotal moment, it would be cinematic. Operatic, even. Peak. I gotta figure out how to get up there. And figure out what a pivotal moment looks like, Rhys thought to himself. He sequestered himself by a pillar and watched the ball progress. Beautiful women and handsome men swirled on the dance floor in a blaze of colors. In this world, it was acceptable for both genders to wear robes, alongside the more traditional gowns and suits, and the dance floor was a mix of men in fine suiting and women in ball gowns, and both in gorgeous, embroidered and layered robes, laden with so much cording, beading, and decoration that some were even more extravagant than the ball gowns. By comparison, Rhys's gown was downright austere. It was fitting for a ghost, he supposed, but he made a mental note that he could play up the drama a bit in the future, and even stick to robes next time. Robes were a better choice for all sorts of reasons: mobility, anonymity, not to mention that he could always try diving into a nearby lake for a YOLO body swap to masculine and hope he could get away with it that way, if he was ever pursued. Plus, they were way better to fight in. Someone tapped his shoulder, and he whirled, but it was only Mouse. She nodded. It sounds like the Empire is still looking for the culprits. There's rumors that they're about to mount an extensive sweep of our first city, since it's so close to the first two camps that got struck, back at the start. That's useful information. We should probably pull out, then, except for the snack shack. Except for, it'd be suspicious if it suddenly closed down before the sweep. Rhys lifted his chin, looking back at the party. He'd gotten his information, but he hadn't managed his dramatic psychological attack yet, nor had he figured out exactly what form he wanted that to take. Still, he could have dressed up as Lord de Vere if all he wanted was to crash the party. He'd come here as Adelise for a reason, and he was going to stop at nothing to ensure that he accomplished what he'd come to accomplish. He pinched his chin. "What is it?" Mouse asked. "What does a pivotal moment look like?" I want to make a big impact, but in a way that doesn't look like I manufactured it," he explained. Mouse blinked at him. "That sounds horrible." He frowned at her, then snorted as he realized, "Right. I'm asking the girl who wants to vanish so badly that it became her path how to get attention. That was foolish of me. Sorry. I didn't consider my question." Mouse shook her head. "Are you sure you really want to draw that much attention to yourself at the first ball? Shouldn't we treat this as a trial, then get, flamboyant at the second one?" Rhys raised his brows. Mouse actually had a point. He could try and create a pivotal moment here, draw attention to his cosplay, and make a scene, or he could be a spooky ghost in all ways, wander around the edges of the ball, interact with no one except for that guy at the buffet table, and allow his myth to naturally expand. There was nothing spooky about the girl who just happened to look like another girl and ran around causing scenes at random balls. There was a lot spooky about the girl who might or might not have been at the ball, looming at the outer corner in the shadow, refusing to acknowledge whether she was or wasn't Adelise Infernon. He nodded. "Let's lurk for a little while longer, then vanish." Mouse nodded aggressively. "But first, could you swing by the buffet table? Those little skewers, and the olive and meat plate, and those little cakes they just brought out." They lurked home from the ball, wandering naturally out into the surrounding yard, then sprinting home through the trees. The servants were already kicking up a fuss about the empty carriage. The absence of Lord de Vere had been noticed, and most importantly of all, Rhys had sampled all the delicacies at the buffet table. He hadn't found his pivotal moment, but he was pretty sure Mouse was right there, that he should play it subtle at first, even if his trashy sensibilities screamed for him to flaunt about. He could be loud later. For now, as he was seeding the rumors in the back of everyone's mind, it was time to be quiet. Whisper, to build the foundation so he could shout later. He nodded to himself. Climb slowly. Practice my act, and go from one ball to another, slowly growing to larger and larger balls. Until, at last, at the biggest ball with the most possible impact, I lose my psychological attack. But until the next ball, he had a business to run, and so much effort for him personally to accomplish. He was absolutely hammered with work. He had to carbonate the soda, imbue the food with impurities, and oversee all the farms, among a dozen other tiny tasks. He'd offloaded as much as he could, but there were still things he simply couldn't hand off. He wanted to find an apprentice, but where? None of the candidate mages were fit for the path of trash, none of them were trash. He wasn't even sure anyone else could pick up his path, or that anyone else would want to. His path was trash, after all. If he had the choice between a trash path and any other path, he sure wouldn't pick the trash path. He only had because he was trash at anything but trash. Well, that's not true. I'd probably chose trash, but I don't think a lot of people would agree with me. Plus, sometimes an annoying and cryptic old man showed up in the mornings and allowed Rhys to quiz him for a short time before vanishing again, sometimes mid-question, or worse, mid-answer. Desmond was quickly becoming one of Rhys's least favorite people. The man seemed to exist to be useless, handing out just enough information to tickle Rhys's brain, but never enough for him to actually pull anything useful out of the facts he shared. Still, he felt as though he were slowly creeping closer to the truth anyways. No one thing Desmond said helped him figure out how he was supposed to handle the void, but all of it together slowly revealed the truth of the void. Every time he talked to the man, he ended up frustrated, but later that day, something would fall into place. Thus, despite how annoying Desmond was, he kept talking to the man. In fact, in some ways, he couldn't help but wonder if Desmond's trash version of enlightenment wasn't resonating with his personal path somehow, if the two of them were perfectly suited to one another. Desmond handed out trash facts, and Rhys could comprehend trash better than anything else. If only the man wasn't so annoying about it, it would be a fantastic setup. As it was, he was barely keeping his head above the water. He didn't know what he needed to do the most, but he knew that he was doing too much. The balls didn't help, but he also enjoyed them more than the rest of his duties, so it wasn't as if he wanted to stop. He wasn't exactly frequenting them, either, and between his teleportation network and the whispers he heard from the snack shack, he barely put any effort into his entrances. After the first, he and Mouse had simply taken to stealing in from the sides. He'd expected a barrier or some kind of magical defenses, but once he'd discovered that most houses lacked such a thing, there was no reason to hold back. It had also been shockingly successful. The rumors of the ghostly shade of Adelise Infernon were spreading, and the Infernon family was on the brink of being unable to bluff about Adelise remaining alive. The fact that he could stand at the edge of the ball, then, thanks to Mouse, blink out of existence between one glance and the next was adding a lot to his ghostliness. And since he'd built himself some comfy robes, and hiding with Mouse was as simple as calling her over and standing nearby, the balls were really more of his rest and relaxation time where he got to eat delicious snacks rather than anything stressful. The fact that it was messing with the Empire's collective consciousness was a bonus. That, and he'd started to lace the fancy foods with impurities. If he could directly poison the elites, that was even better than generally poisoning the Empire. He felt nothing for the fact that his poisons did hit some innocents. Most of those who were hit who were innocent weren't mages, and wouldn't face any severe penalties from the small debuff impurities would have on them. As for the mages, he didn't believe any Empire mages were innocent. They all engaged in the Empire's foul construct, and there was nothing they could do to deny that they were using other mages' cores. The only upside was that he didn't need to sleep. The downside was that he needed to not sleep. Rhys sighed. Being the leader of a revolution was tough. Even tougher when he was also the head of this world's first fast food chain and standing in as a ghost at balls. No one understood his struggles. Hey, Lyra. She looked up from where she was cleansing a vat of water. What? This is a once-in-a-lifetime honor, so I want you to consider it deeply. No. What? Come on. I don't want your path. You just want to offload your workload, and I don't want to be your underling. Also, your path sucks. It doesn't suck. It's trash. Rhys opened his mouth, then shut it, then spread his hands. It could not be. You don't know. He sighed. What if I just taught you the carbonation technique? It's water-related. You might be able to learn it. She raised her brows. That's true, I suppose. Why don't you try describing it for me? Rhys nodded. He took a deep breath, then started speaking. It was hard to describe a magical technique. Even when he understood everything that was happening, it was still hard to explain exactly what he was doing, especially when he knew Lyra didn't exactly have a great concept on what carbon dioxide was or how to create it, or what made it different from ordinary air. It took a bit of flailing, and a match in a sealed glass, but he got the idea across. So it's like a different kind of liquid. Not water. But air, Lyra clarified. Exactly, Rhys said, nodding. And perfectly clear like air, like pure alcohol and water. Yep. She took a deep breath and let it out, her eyes closed as she focused. Give me some time. I think I can master this. Air, when you think about it, is very similar to liquid. Totally agree. Well, not quite, but that's way too complicated for this relatively simple process. Lyra touched her hand to her chin. Slowly, she nodded. Give me a few hours. I'll give it my best effort. That's all I can ask. Lyra wandered away, and Rhys turned, taking in the room full of potential victims, helpful assistants whom he could offload tasks to. The biggest problem was how many of them were still locked out of magehood due to him not acquiring more cores. He'd been able to use Lord Devere's energy to recore another mage, but that was only one. He needed to make his move on the criminals, and soon, if he was going to meaningfully apply the mages he'd recovered to his task. But the Empire was still looking for the criminals. The patrols were flagging, but they were still ongoing. He needed that perfect opening, while the criminals were still suppressed, but the empire wasn't on high alert anymore. It was approaching, day by day, but if he moved now, it would still be too early. It felt like such a waste, to sit on so many potential mages who couldn't even grow stronger yet, but if he moved now, he'd only get hammered by the empire. He had to wait. Be patient. He hated it, but it was what he had to do. The right move, so that he could strike with all his power later. If history looked back on this moment, and saw that he hastily made a move while the empire was still searching for him all over like a knocked over anthill, it would frown with stringent disapproval, as it should, and he knew that. It just sucks when you're living it. He sighed aloud. When it came right down to it, he didn't want to teach anyone else his impurity imbuing technique, it was kind of too powerful to casually hand off. The carbonation technique was whatever. Teaching Lyra how to incorporate gases into liquids didn't seem like it had a huge danger curve in the future, though who knew? Maybe it would become an issue. As long as she was on his side, though, he didn't mind if she caused a few problems for the empire. I really didn't expect teaching someone else magic to come with this immediate backlash of responsibility and concerns, Rhys thought. He glanced around, then headed to the door and looked out, gazing at the city. This was the city where they'd started, the tavern they'd rented from that boy, the one he had become to think of as his home base, not too deep into the empire, still in its claimed territory, and just around the bend from Purple Dawn's ruins. He knew he shouldn't get attached, since this was the enemy's territory, but somehow, it was starting to feel like home. He leaned against the doorframe, just watching. They still had the stand set up outside, since their kitchen operations had expanded to take the entirety of the ex-tavern's space. He was basically treating the space as a test kitchen for all his shops, so there was no room to actually sell product inside. The people who lived here had come to be used to receiving their snacks from a stand, rather than a building, anyways, so it lined up with their expectations. Even now, they lined up outside the door, stretching off down the road. He looked it over, taking in the military students, the adult members of the military, the low-ranked nobles and the casually dressed mages who worked office jobs for the military, and had less stringent dress codes as a result. The lines weren't as long as in their fad heyday, but it was still a nice little line, long enough that Rhys felt satisfied about. His eyes locked with one of the military students. For a moment, time stood still. The military student's eyes widened, and he stepped forward, gasping a breath. Rhys turned and walked away, striding away from the building as if he'd never been associated with it at all. His heart raced, adrenaline pumping. Silently, he chanted, "You saw nothing. You didn't see anyone. There was just a random guy in weird robes lounging by that door for no reason, and Rena. Rhys." A timid voice tried. Rhys walked faster. Fuck. The sharp tap-tap of jackboots sounded close on Rhys's heels as he power-walked away at top speed. "It's you, isn't it? Rhys. I don't know who you're talking about," Rhys rumbled in his best gruff voice. "Fuck. I knew Laurent came by Purple Dawn once or so a year, but I didn't know he lurked around town. No, damn it, that's on me. It's obvious he'd use this city as his base if he was heading to Purple Dawn." Mana rushed toward his back. Rhys dodged, shocked, but it was only a grab for his shoulder, which he easily avoided. "Please, stop. Just, even if we don't know one another, let me get a good look at your face, and then I'll let you go." Rhys considered, even as he continued to walk away. He had altered his bone structure to be more like Adelise's, both in his body and his face, so it was possible that Laurent might not recognize him if he did stop and let the man look him over. On the other hand, his face wasn't that different. He wasn't skilled enough at Lyra's technique to completely and utterly transform his face into someone else's. The edits he'd made really were a small alteration to his bone structure to make his face more like Adelise's. If he had to say, it probably was a 20% difference from his old face to this one, and the rest of the 80% to get to Adelise came from makeup. The changes his face had undergone throughout the last 3 years of puberty in the mines were equally, if not more, drastic. He was definitely recognizable as Rhys. Yep. Can't turn around, no matter how much Bright Eyes wants me to. He sped up. Fortunately, he'd been working back of house, so he wasn't wearing his Harlequin gear or his face paint, which meant his disguise and connection with the snack shop wasn't necessarily busted. Unfortunately, he'd been working back of house, so he wasn't wearing his Harlequin gear and face paint, which meant he was very, definitely recognizable as Rhys. Please. Rhys Power walked around a corner, whipping the turn as tight and sharp as he could. The second he was out of Lawrence's sight, he took off at top speed. He couldn't use Trash Step here, but even so, he could use his base strength as a Tier 3 to run faster than most Tier 2 mages. Laurent should just be a Tier 2 mage, so there was no way he'd be able to keep up. A trash can caught his eye. It was meant to act as the teleport point for this shop, but it could work both ways. He dove into it. I just wanted to say, no matter what, Laurent looked around. The street was empty. The figure he'd been chasing was gone, as if it had been an illusion all along. He sighed. Maybe it had all been in his head, and he'd just been chasing some random person. Their figure had been slightly wrong, and their face hadn't quite been right. But, if he was right, he shook his head. It was a foolish thought. If he was wrong, they were right to run away. If he was right, even more so. No matter what he wanted, he could never go back to those days. But, if only. In a distant city, Rhys popped out of a trash can and ran his hair back, his heart still pumping even if he was well out of danger. He sighed aloud and fell back against the wall, a little shocked at how much that had startled him. He'd been totally taken by surprise, true, but it wasn't as if Laurent had sneak attacked him. The guy was bigger, now, taller, his shoulders broader, but his face, his uniform, and that silly ponytail were exactly the same. Well, that wasn't quite true. Maybe there was a little more braid on his uniform, a few more medals, but it was mostly the same. So much the same, as if no time had passed at all. In fact, for a second, Rhys had felt as though they were still in Purple Dawn, still young, with nothing but a difference in political opinion between them. And yet, so much had happened. While he'd spent 3 years rotting in a mine, Laurent had been up here, in the sun, growing and changing, experiencing the world and living his life. He'd probably had a girlfriend, by now, a real girlfriend, seen lots and lots of the Empire, made new friends and learned new techniques. Eaten good food, skinny dipped at midnight, met strange creatures and read wonderful books. Lived his life. And what had Rhys been doing? Struggling in the mines, risking life and limb to rescue those the Empire Laurent served, willfully oppressed because they weren't convenient for the Empire to acknowledge. Fighting a criminal enterprise the Empire overlooked to maybe take one step toward restoring what the Empire had stolen from those mages he'd rescued. He was stressing over his decisions and spending every living moment awake, working on his plans to destroy the Empire. There had always been a gap between him and Laurent. By now, that gap had to be unassailable. In some other world, in a world where they both spent the last 3 years in the light, growing and laughing, smiling with their loved ones, they might have been friends. But in this world, they were fated to be bitter enemies, and there was nothing Rhys nor Laurent could do to change that. He hadn't thought it would bother him. He hadn't thought it would do anything at all. But, strangely, oddly, seeing Laurent, it had brought it all home to Rhys. What he'd lost. What he'd missed out on. What he couldn't have, at least while the Empire was active, and maybe forever, for the rest of his life. All those things Laurent effortlessly had, safety, security, the peace in knowing his loved ones would be safe, Rhys could not have. It hurt. It stung. Deep in his chest, it ached, pinching and twisting like a knife. He didn't know if it was jealousy or regret, or sorrow for what he had lost, but it hurt. To tell the truth, it was always there. Normally, he didn't feel it, because he actively didn't think about it, but seeing Laurent had driven it all home. How much he was missing out on, and didn't have. How much the Empire had taken from him and everyone else he cared about. He took a deep breath, steeling his resolve. That was exactly why he had to defeat the Empire. Once he defeated them, he could go on living his life the way he wanted to, rather than the way some asshole with too much power and money wanted him to. These 4 years would be nothing but a bad dream, a blink of the eye in his long mage life, and he could forget them as if they'd never happened. He just had to lock in and finish destroying the Empire. But first, he leaned against the wall and crossed his arms. He didn't know how long it would take Laurent to get his chips and leave, or if the guy was still obsessive enough to wait around for hours, but it was probably best if he played it safe and waited for the coast to clear. After that rude reminder, he kind of needed a break, anyways. When he returned, it was dark outside. He'd spent the afternoon wandering the other city, clearing his mind rather than doing anything productive. It had given him the time he needed to reset, and now he was ready to keep moving. Figure out his next big conquest, so he could enable the biggest conquest of all, aka the Empire. He took a deep breath, but before he could get started, Mouse appeared in his line of sight. Rhys barely suppressed the urge to shout and managed to plaster a smile on his face instead. "Damn it, Mouse, you scared the shit out of me. Warn a guy. Are you ready?" she asked. Ready for what? She gave him a look as if it were obvious, a rare move for Mouse. "The ball tonight. You know, the big one in town. The one where we're going to try our first pivotal moment." Rhys blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He'd totally forgotten. Seeing Laurent had completely blown it out of his mind. Did you forget? It's okay. We can." Rhys shook his head. "No. We've been working too hard for this one. We keep going, we don't give up just because I forgot. Though maybe we should back out." With Laurent in town, Rhys shook his head, immediately suppressing the thought. He wasn't afraid of Laurent, and he wasn't going to run because of the guy, either. Laurent probably wasn't even invited to this ball. It was for nobility, not random students. In fact, he was probably safer at the ball than wandering around this town. Laurent was probably on his way to Purple Dawn, and had no time to waste on random endeavors like shitty balls for the annoying nobility. Not that Rhys knew Laurent's opinion on nobles, but a lot of the military students seemed to hold that opinion, from what he'd heard listening in on the snack shacks. About the only ones who didn't were ones who were either nobility themselves, or some distant side family of nobility, who benefited from nobles despite not being a true noble themselves. Then again, Laurent was there with the Empress, when she was conquering Purple Dawn, a little voice whispered in the back of his mind. They usually didn't let random military students hang around the Empress, at least, in his world, that wouldn't happen. Maybe it was different here. The Empress was big on her meritocracy, even if it was rotten to the core and a meritocracy on the surface only. Maybe she'd brought him onto her flagship to drive home to all the nobles how anyone had the right to have an audience with the Empress, as long as they achieved enough. Regardless, there was no way Laurent would show up at the ball. And even if he did, well, Rhys had fully perfected his Adelise disguise by now. He looked more like the red-headed Infernon than he did himself by a mile. If he'd been in full Adelise form, Laurent wouldn't have stood a chance of recognizing him as Rhys. There was absolutely no reason not to go. I'm not missing out. I'm enjoying life in my own way, and helping lots of other people, and doing something meaningful with my life. If anything, it's Laurent who's missing out. So decided, Rhys hurried off to get fixed up for the ball, while Mouse scurried off into her own space to get changed into her servant gear. This really was a big ball, and not just because they'd decided to make it the ball. It was being held by an ally of the Infernons, which made it more likely that an Infernon would appear, which at this point, would be a plus. The ally of the Infernons was highly powerful and influential in this city, and was also highly likely to have an emotional reaction to seeing Adelisa's ghost. In fact, it was rumored that the lord of the house holding the ball refused to believe the rumors, and had pledged to destroy the ghost if it dared appear. Not that it would, he'd insisted, because ghosts weren't real, which meant it could only be a miscreant causing trouble for everyone. He wasn't wrong, but it was exactly because he'd made such a bold and absolute statement that Rhys knew he was the perfect target for his pivotal moment. He'd gotten everything all set up, and the moment was ripe. He wasn't going to back out because of some pathetic tier 2 mage. Wait, Did I scan him? Was he actually tier 2? Rhys thought back, but couldn't recall the answer. He'd been so panicked that he hadn't been thinking clearly, and he certainly couldn't remember what had happened in so much detail. He shook his head. It didn't matter. Laurent had nothing to do with tonight. Tonight, it was time to execute the final blow of his psychological attack, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Least of all Laurent. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.